Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. This is the Change is Hard class, and I'm glad you're all here. The Department of Licensing has some pretty strict rules about what you have to do in order to gain credit. We need to know, first of all, who you are. So please make sure that your first and last names appear in the screen box with your face. There will be people monitoring the class to make sure that everybody who's in attendance is actually in attendance with their cameras on and paying attention. If you are just here for the information and you don't care about the credit, then you don't have to have your camera on, and you won't get credit if your camera is not on. Again, those are DOL rules, not ours. If you don't know how to change your name so that we can see both your first and your last name, use the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner of the frame with your face in it. And you'll find a button for rename, and then you can type in your name, first and last. If you are in a classroom or a conference room with multiple people, please make sure that we have some way of identifying who you are. After class, you will, whoever's in charge will submit a roster of everyone who is in attendance with an affidavit, verifying that everybody was there. So we need to know who it is that will be doing that. I see a Port Angeles Association of Realtors on the screen. I see some real estate firms on the screen. That's fine as long as we can identify who you are when you submit your affidavit. All right.
So you totally
with respect to the class itself, we are jam-packed with material from wall to wall. I'm hoping that we will take 2 10-minute breaks. I've only taught this class once, and we didn't take any breaks, essentially. But I will make sure that you have a few minutes to jump up and grab a glass of water if you need to, or something like that. The question signs will show up in the materials themselves. Will come to a screen that says, do you have any questions? And the way that the materials are generally, we're going to talk about listing issues, and we're going to talk about buyer brokerage issues, and then we're going to put it all together with forms usage. And so at the end of both of those first 2 sections, we have a break for questions. So hang on to your questions as we're going through, and then we'll make sure there's time to ask them. If we get to the end and we don't have enough time and there's still more questions, I'll stick around until all of your questions are answered. All right.
Should we physically have a packet of the information, or is this all on screen?
Everything was emailed to you. When you received the Zoom link, you also had an attachment with the class materials, which would include a printout of the slides that we're going to be discussing, as well as the forms that we're discussing. So you should all have that. I'm not sure all of you have printed it out, but it was all made available to you. That is the set of forms materials.
I think we're good here. I'm gonna go back downstairs. Okay, hold on.
All right, let's get started. By way of very quick background, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because most of you already know what I'm about to say, but this is absolutely essential for an understanding of everything that is changing within the industry. The question, if you don't already know, the question is why. If you don't already know the answer to that question, the answer is because of investigations by the Department of Justice and some class action lawsuits filed by plaintiffs who were prior sellers of real estate listing their property through an MLS. The underlying allegation that drove both the Department of Justice investigation and the lawsuits, the many lawsuits at this point, is an allegation that the real estate brokerage industry collectively, and while NAR is the primary defendant in the lawsuit, the issue at the heart of this investigation was a broader industry practice, not just an NAR rule. And in fact, those of you who are Northwest MLS members know that your rules changed back in October of 2019, but prior to that rules change, Northwest MLS engaged in the exact same practice. So what is the practice that is driving the many changes in our industry today? It is a practice that required sellers to offer compensation to listing firms, to agree to pay compensation to a listing firm, and then required the listing firm to make an offer of compensation to a buyer broker. When that buyer broker succeeded in selling the property, the buyer broker would be paid compensation from the seller's proceeds through the listing firm. There are a number of allegations that arose from that practice, starting with the fact that buyer brokers, and again, this is the allegation. You can you can believe it or not agree with it. I don't care. It's the allegation, and it is what's driven the changes. The allegation is that because sellers offer compensation to buyer brokers would steer buyers to specific properties. And that if the seller did not offer sufficient compensation to a buyer broker, then a buyer broker would not show seller's property. And the result of this was that it caused sellers collectively to have to pay a consistent and inflated rate of compensation, and it took away from buyers any voice that a buyer should have in their own contract negotiations with a buyer broker. It prevented buyers from benefiting from negotiating down, reducing down the amount of compensation their broker would take, because, excuse me, even if a buyer agreed to take less compensation, the beneficiary of that negotiation would not have been the buyer, but would have instead been the listing firm, because even if a buyer broker takes less compensation under this rule, the remaining compensation that seller had offered goes back to the listing firm. So it took away from buyers the ability to negotiate with their own broker, and it also took away any ability to frame the amount of compensation around the specifics of a transaction. How complex is this transaction? What is buyer broker's level of competence? How much work did the buyer themselves do in putting the transaction together, finding the property, for example? And so that industry practice was at the heart of the investigations. DOJ started its investigation in 2018. The lawsuits that drove the change were filed in 2019. They perpetuated for several years, finally reaching a conclusion in October of last year when a jury returned a verdict against the National Association of Realtors and several large franchises in the amount of $1.8 billion, a judgment that would have been increased to $5.8 billion because it was an antitrust claim. NAR could not pay a $5.8 billion judgment, and if they had paid or even posted around that amount, that would have done nothing to resolve the other, at the time, over 30 copycat lawsuits that were also pending. So NAR chose to settle the lawsuit. The settlement is what ultimately creates all of the change that we'll be describing today. It's the NAR settlement agreement. It takes effect on August 17th. You're going to hear several dates that we're going to reference throughout the class pretty repeatedly. August 17th is the date that the NAR settlement agreement takes effect as it relates to NAR. August 17th is a Sunday. So there was no way that Northwest MLS was going to release statewide forms changes on a Sunday. So the statewide forms revisions, the revised forms, will be released on August 15th. Effective August 15th, you will be using the revised forms we're describing today rather than the forms you're using currently, with one exception, and that one exception is Form 1A SWF, which we'll talk about more in a minute. The settlement affects all Realtor members. All of you who are individual Realtor members, the settlement agreement affects you. It affects all NAR MLSs. Northwest MLS did not opt into the settlement agreement and is not an NAR MLS. And so Northwest MLS is not subject to the settlement agreement, but Northwest MLS is absolutely impacted by the settlement agreement, as are all members of the brokerage community. To keep our language straight in this class, let's define who is who. If you're a Northwest MLS member, you probably already know that, and your MLS is not affiliated with the National Association of Realtors. Northwest MLS did not opt into the settlement agreement, and in fact, Northwest MLS has chosen to continue publishing seller offers of compensation to buyer brokers on the Northwest MLS. The other MLSs that are listed on the screen are NAR MLSs. Spokane Association, PAC MLS, Yakima, Northeast Washington, the Olympic Listing Service, and the RMLS. I won't reference any of the NAR MLSs individually going forward, with the exception of RMLS on a couple of issues, but I will speak instead broadly to the NAR MLSs. So if you are a member of any of those 6, then you'll know that I'm describing you when I reference NAR MLS members. The settlement takes effect on August 17th. On August 17th, well, again, that's a Sunday. So prior to August 17th, postcards will be mailed to sellers who may be able to opt in to the lawsuit. You should expect that some of your prior sellers will be receiving those postcards. They're similar to the postcards that your sellers may have received before from prior settlements of this lawsuit and others like this. You need to be prepared for how you're going to have a conversation with your sellers. If a seller asks you, what is this all about? Was I somehow or another taken advantage of in this process? Remember the value you provided to your sellers. Help your sellers to remember the value you provided to your sellers. Ultimately, if your seller is asking you what they should do with respect to this potential, becoming a potential plaintiff in this lawsuit, that's a question you should refer them to talk to their lawyer about. That's not a question you can answer for them. With the settlement agreement taking effect, the NAR MLSs will no longer publish offers of compensation on their MLSs. Some of the NAR MLSs in Washington have already modified their listing printout fields so that compensation is already removed from the MLS printout. All of the NAR MLSs will make that change not later than August 17th. And then the other significant practice change, significant to everybody but Washington real estate brokers, because the change, it already took effect in Washington on January 1st, is that all buyer brokers must enter a buyer brokerage services agreement with a buyer client before touring a home with that buyer. We'll talk more about the differences and similarities with that change in Washington law when we a little later in the class. Okay. So again, the biggest difference between Northwest MLS and the NAR MLSs is that after August 17th, Northwest MLS will continue to publish offers of compensation that sellers may make for buyer brokers on its MLS, and no NAR MLS will do so. Let's go ahead and talk about the listing agreements that each of you will use based on the MLS to which you are a member, or of which you are a member. Northwest MLS members will typically use Form 1A as their listing agreement. Members of any NAR MLS will typically use Form 1A SWF. SWF stands for statewide forms. The exception to that statement is that RMLS members may use the RMLS listing agreement. Something that you should know is that no MLS requires you to use a specific listing agreement. You are free to use whatever listing agreement you want. You're free to modify the listing agreement that's given to you from your MLS however you want. But most MLSs will require that if you're going to list in their MLS, that you include at least some basic provisions in whatever listing agreement you choose to use. For example, Northwest MLS publishes Form 1C. If you as a Northwest MLS member use a listing agreement other than Form 1A, Northwest MLS expects you to include as an addendum to that listing agreement Form 1C to cover the bare minimum provisions that are required for you to list in their MLS. Every MLS will require that you use their input data sheet along with whatever boilerplate listing agreement you use. So Forms 1A and 1A SWF include the basic boilerplate provisions that you're going to use when creating a contract with your seller. But each form references the listing input data sheet. The listing input data sheet is generated by each individual MLS, and it mimics or it mirrors the fields that will be present on the listing printout, so that you can collect the information from your seller that you will then need to put into the listing print, put into the MLS to show up in the listing printout properly. 1A, and let me just tell you right now, if you're an RMLS member and you use the RMLS listing agreement, I'm not going to be speaking to that form at all today, other than what I have already said. It is a very different form in appearance from 1A and 1ASWF. I've seen the form. I'm not familiar enough with the provisions, and I don't teach the RMLS listing agreement. So I'm going to be talking today about 1A and 1ASWF. And again, understand 1A is the form that's typically used by Northwest MLS members. 1ASWF is typically used by NAR MLS members. Paragraph 7A of those two forms is identical, and all of you need to be familiar with what paragraph 7A of your listing agreement says, because that is the provision where you will create compensation between your listing firm and the seller. The amount of compensation your listing firm will be paid. Paragraph 7A has two subparts, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2. In Roman numeral 1, you will identify the amount of compensation that the seller will pay the listing firm upon a successful conclusion of the listing agreement, the amount that the seller will pay the listing firm if the buyer is represented. If the buyer is represented by any other real estate broker, it could be a real estate broker licensed to a different firm. It could be a real estate broker licensed to your firm. It could be you as a limited dual agent, assuming the seller has initialed the paragraph that consents to you serving as a limited dual agent. Roman numeral 2 of paragraph 7A in the listing agreement says that you will be paid the identified amount of compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. Now, you can fill out these provisions however you and the seller agree. There are two different provisions because some listing agents will say to the seller, if the buyer is unrepresented, I will inherently have more risk in this transaction than if the buyer is represented. And I will do more work if the buyer is unrepresented than I would do if the buyer were represented. And as a result of that, seller, I'm asking you to agree that I will be paid more compensation if the buyer is unrepresented than if the buyer is represented. I'm not telling you you have to put two different numbers in those amounts. And if you don't put any amount in Roman numeral 2, it's going to default to Roman numeral 1. But if you do put a different amount in subsection Roman numeral 2, and the buyer is unrepresented, then you and your firm will be paid whatever amount is in subsection Roman numeral 2. Please understand that subsection Roman numeral 2 replaces Roman numeral 1 if the buyer is unrepresented. So if you put in that blank something like, we won't deal in this class in percentages or dollar values because you are a collection of about 500 competitors. So I typically teach with a compensation medium of chocolate truffles. If you put in your Roman numeral 1, that seller will pay you 5 chocolate truffles, but in the event buyer is unrepresented, if you write 1 chocolate truffle in that amount, believing wrongly in your mind that the 2 will be added together, and in that case you would receive 6 chocolate truffles, you won't. If the buyer is unrepresented, you will receive only 1 chocolate truffle in that scenario. Understand how to use that provision because you don't want to make a mistake.
Right.
You, however, want to understand when is a buyer unrepresented. You're the listing broker. Now, this might seem really simple, and it is, but it still creates a lot of confusion for brokers, so let's just get it out there. You're the listing broker. A buyer approaches you, and the buyer says, I don't have representation. You could, as the seller's exclusive agent, write an offer for this buyer and take the seller and the buyer all the way through the transaction, through closing, representing the seller exclusively and buyer having no representation at all. That is entirely possible. And if that's what happens, then your compensation would be paid under your listing agreement, paragraph 7A, Roman numeral, subsection Roman numeral 2. Or in that same scenario, you're the listing broker, buyer approaches and says, I have no representation. In that scenario, you could become a limited dual agent, meaning that you would represent seller and buyer. The only way you can become a limited dual agent is if both the seller and the buyer have entered an agency agreement with you. Clearly, seller already has, so this buyer would also have to enter a BBSA, a buyer brokerage services agreement with you. And both the seller and the buyer would have to initial their consent to you serving as a limited dual agent. In that scenario, you would represent seller and you would also represent buyer, but understand buyer is represented in that scenario. You will not receive the compensation identified in paragraph 7A, Roman numeral 2. You will receive the compensation for your listing services that is identified in paragraph 7A, Roman numeral 1. And then you will also receive whatever compensation it is that you and the buyer have negotiated as the compensation that you'll receive. Now let's look specifically at Form 1A SWF. This, again, SWF stands for statewide forms. This is the form that will be used primarily by brokers who are members of an NAR MLS. It bears the revised form bears a revision date of 8/24, August 24, 2024. And it is now the only form that you should be using. You should not be using any Form 1A SWF with a different revision date. If you have a Form 1A SWF that you're about to hand a seller to sign, and it has a revision date other than 8/24, don't use it, and instead access the revised Form 1A SWF, which is currently available on the Express Forms system through Northwest MLS if you access forms through Express Forms. And if you don't access forms through Express Forms, then the place you are going to find 1A SWF in the short term, meaning between now and August 15th, is on the Washington Realtors website. You'll look at the front screen, you'll find a link to 1A SWF. You'll have to get past the password protected screen, so you're gonna have to enter your Washington Realtors credentials, and then you can access a fillable PDF of the 1A SWF. Why is this important? Because all of you who are 1A SWF users should be replacing any old versions of the form that you have currently in use. So if you are an NAR MLS member and you use 1A SWF and you have active listings, meaning the seller is, the property is on the market right now, you're still looking for a buyer, and you have a 1A SWF that does not bear the revision date of August 24, you need to replace your listing agreements. And in a perfect world, you replace your listing agreement before your MLS modifies the data field to remove the compensation provision. When you update your listing agreement using Form 1A SWF, you are going to notice something missing that you're accustomed to. The revised Form 1A SWF has no remaining provision for a seller to offer compensation to a buyer broker. Every listing firm that is a member of an NAR MLS will have to create its own language for its sellers to offer compensation to a buyer broker. Because of the NAR settlement, an NAR MLS can no longer, as a collective, offer language to its members for its members to use when sellers want to offer compensation to a buyer or broker. It is a full expectation that there will still be sellers listed in the NARMLSs who want to offer compensation to buyer brokers. And so every listing firm needs to come up with their own language for that to happen. And you could put that language, designated brokers, you're the one who's going to have to come up with this language. Nobody else is going to be able to do it. Designated broker, you're going to come up with it for everybody in your firm. And you could create language that will be cut and paste into the other section of the Form 1A SWF. Or designated brokers, you could create an addendum to the 1A SWF that puts forth this language that the listing broker will use when their seller wants to offer compensation to a buyer broker. Or, designated broker, you could have your firm create a standalone contract or a standalone offer that would complement the listing agreement, but that would separately create seller's offer terms for offering compensation. Which of these options is the best? I have no opinion as to which is the best, as long as it creates language that you can use. If you're going to use the cut and paste method, putting the language into the other section of your listing agreement, then designated brokers, make sure your brokers can cut and paste that language, put it into the other section without modifying the language, because you want your brokers to be using the language that you give them to use. If you use either an addendum or a standalone offer, I do think there is an advantage to that. When you use that separate addendum that's going to add to the listing agreement, or a standalone offer, and a buyer broker contacts the listing broker and says, hey, is your seller offering compensation, and if so, in what amount? Then designated brokers, your listing broker can simply shoot that standalone document, whether it's an addendum or a standalone offer of compensation, straight over to the buyer broker without sending over the entire listing agreement. Most of you are not going to want to send over your entire listing agreement, but if all that you have to send over is the addendum setting forth the seller's offer of compensation, or a standalone form making the seller's offer of compensation, that's easier to send over. I would suggest that if you're going to use the standalone offer of compensation, that you ask your firm's lawyer to draft that form for you, because again, it won't be an addendum to the listing agreement. It will be a standalone form that needs to complement the listing agreement. You want to make sure it does not conflict with the listing agreement or create ambiguity by covering the same terms differently. If as a designated broker, you're going, okay, well, what now? How do I create this language? Let's say I want to have an addendum. How do I create the language? Don't work too hard, designated brokers. You have many examples of compensation provisions that you can pull from. In the materials included with this class, you're given a copy of Form 1A, and Form 1A has language in paragraph 7B by which a seller can offer compensation to a buyer broker. Utilize the resources you have if you don't want to hire your firm's lawyer to draft that language. Whatever you do use, however, designated brokers, look at the very last bullet point on this slide. You must include language making clear that there are no standard compensation rates, and that if seller chooses to offer compensation to a buyer broker, it is fully negotiable and not set by law. Okay, Form 1A, the Northwest MLS listing agreement. Paragraph 7B has language that all of you are already familiar with because it did not change dramatically, language that allows a seller to offer compensation to a buyer broker. The biggest difference in this revised Form 1A is that a seller can now, instead of offering compensation in a specific amount, seller could instead choose to mark a box that says, I'm willing to consider paying compensation. Buyer, bring me an offer that includes compensation, and I'll consider it in the context of your offer to purchase my property. The other thing that is really significant, and Form 1A SWF users, listen to what I'm about to say, because this could impact you. For brokers who are who are members of Northwest MLS using Form 1A, there is a checkbox provision that allows the seller to extend their offer of compensation to a buyer broker beyond the members of Northwest MLS. Seller can check this box and say, by checking this box, I want to make my offer of compensation to a buyer broker available to any licensed broker, regardless of the MLS of which they are a member. What about a scenario where a broker is a member of an NAR MLS and also Northwest MLS? In that scenario, where you want to list the property in two different MLSs, one of them being Northwest MLS and one of them being an NAR MLS, you are going to have to enter two different listing agreements. Your seller is going to have to enter two different listing agreements. They're going to have to enter the Form 1A for Northwest MLS and also 1A SWF for your NAR MLS. Two things I want you to be aware of in this scenario. Number one, you are going to have to make sure that your seller is protected from any obligation to pay the listing firm's compensation twice. Because in fact, they will be signing two different contracts, each of which obligate the seller to pay the listing firm compensation. So you will need to create either some kind of an overarching addendum that covers both contracts, or at least some sort of reliable written representation to the seller that even though the seller has to sign two different listing agreements because of your membership in two different MLSs and the benefit the seller gets from being in both Northwest MLS and an NAR MLS, even though they have to sign two listing agreements, they will never be required to pay the listing firm compensation twice. The other thing you need to be aware of is this. If a seller signs the Northwest MLS listing agreement Form 1A and and offers compensation to a buyer broker, and then marks the box extending that offer to non-Northwest MLS members, and your seller then also signs Form 1A SWF, you do not need to attach an additional addendum or other language to your existing Form 1A SWF in order for seller to have offered compensation to a buyer broker, because they did that in the 1A, and you mark the box extending that offer of compensation to non-Northwest MLS members, which will include the NAR MLS members that are part of the other MLS to which you belong. So again, if you are a member of both MLSs and seller is signing both 1A and 1A SWF, you will not need to have any separate language included with your 1A SWF for seller to offer compensation to the buyer broker, so long as the seller has offered compensation in Form 1A and checked the box extending that offer of compensation to non-Northwest MLS members. Once published in the MLS, Northwest MLS listings will include any offer of compensation that seller may have made to a buyer broker, but after August 17th, no NAR MLS listing printout will show an offer of compensation to a buyer broker. Again, there is every expectation that sellers will continue to want to offer compensation to a buyer broker, but it can not be published in the MLS. And that means it can't be published in any way, shape, or form. There won't be a data field for it, and you can't put it in the public remarks. You can't put it in the agent-only remarks. You can't create a code with a number of smiley faces that represent the percentage that seller will pay buyer. You can't create a code by saying how many hours it will take before the seller will allow you to show the property. You can't attach an associated document that establishes buyer broker compensation. You can't say remarks that include buyer broker friendly or all buyers are welcome or anything else that might be a tip off that the seller is offering compensation to a buyer broker. That will violate your MLS rules. But you can and you must make sellers' offer of compensation known in any other way. just not through the MLS or through any other aggregation of information that is fed by your MLS system. You can advertise, you should advertise seller's offer of compensation to a buyer broker in social media, in your website, or on your broker or on your firm's website for your listings only. You cannot, ABC firm cannot advertise XYZ firm's listings on the ABC website and include any offers of compensation. You can put it on your yard sign. I'm already hearing of brokers including a runner on their yard sign that says something along the lines of buyer broker compensation available. You're probably not going to specify the amount on that yard sign that would limit its availability, but brokers are already creating those yard signs. Many of you create flyers that you have on the kitchen countertop. You could put on that flyer on the kitchen countertop the amount of compensation that seller has offered to a buyer broker. And in any other advertising that you might generate for the listing, you can disclose the amount of compensation. You should disclose the amount of compensation that seller is offering to a buyer broker. And when I say you should, you're actually required by the terms of the settlement agreement to do that. And you're required by Washington law, because Washington law requires you to proceed with reasonable skill and care in representing your seller, which would include advertising the things that seller has asked you to use to market the property. When seller offers compensation to a buyer broker, that is intended by seller to make the property more marketable. You must highlight that information for buyer brokers. And then finally, you're going to get phone calls from buyer brokers asking the question, phone calls, text messages, emails. Is your seller offering compensation? Make sure you're prepared to answer those questions. A question that I received the last time I taught this class, and I apologize, this is not in your materials because I just added this to the slides yesterday. So if you want to be able to go back and reference this, do a screenshot of the information on your screen right now. There was a question that I was asked the last time I taught, and I am extraordinarily unsavvy when it comes to tech issues. And so I couldn't answer the question about linking an MLS printout to your own contact information. But I found an FAQ on the NAR settlement website. So in the title of this slide, you see the website information itself, how you can locate the FAQs that NAR has put out. They're very, very informative, by the way. This is question number 45. And so I've highlighted down here just the information that I think is most relevant to this discussion. And MLS may not allow MLS listings to have an embedded link to a website, which with a single click on the MLS listing would immediately display an offer of compensation. Stacy, what do you need?
Nothing. I'm good right now, Annie.
Okay, sorry. I saw your hand go up. I didn't know if you needed to say something. Okay. All right. Oh, gosh, I think I already covered this. I'm sorry. I should have had I didn't remember that I had this slide coming up. I've already told you that if you are a Form 1A SWF user, then you need to update your 1A SWF. If you are an RMLS user, then the RMLS, I believe, is producing an addendum that you can use to modify your RMLS listing. If you're unhappy that there is no addendum to use with 1A SWF, that's on me. You can be unhappy with me. As we were considering all of the forms revisions, the way it made sense to me is you are going to have to approach the seller and have them sign something anyway. So with having them sign an entirely new listing agreement, you're going to explain the changes in the industry, that their offers of compensation will no longer be published. And here's how I will be getting that information out for you. Form 1A, Northwest MLS members, you are not required by the Northwest MLS to update your listing agreement, Form 1A. Your firm, however, may require you to update your Form 1A, and if so, then you do what your firm's office policies require. Question that we have gotten a lot lately, there is an untrue rumor circulating within the industry, which says that if I am a Realtor member and also a member of Northwest MLS, then I have to terminate one of those memberships. Because if I am a Realtor member and also a member of Northwest MLS, knowing that Northwest MLS will continue to publish offers of compensation in the MLS, then I am putting myself in jeopardy. I'm risking the loss of liability protection under the settlement agreement, and I will be in violation of the NAR Code of Ethics. And neither of those statements is true. NAR Realtor members who are also members of Northwest MLS will not be in violation of the settlement agreement or any ethics rule by continuing as a member of Northwest MLS, which will publish offers of compensation in the MLS. And so again, late last night, I found an FAQ directly on point with this issue, since this has become a big deal in the industry. So again, in the heading of the slide, you can find the website where you can access this information yourself. It is currently question number 38, and I say currently because they're adding new questions all the time, so the numbers change, but it's currently number 38, and it asks that question directly. If a Realtor member is also a member of an MLS that is not subject to the settlement agreement and that chooses to continue publishing offers of compensation, does that put the Realtor member in jeopardy? And the answer is no. And again, I've highlighted probably the most relevant language. The settlement agreement does not prohibit a Realtor member, from participating in an MLS that did not opt in and that continues to allow offers of compensation. Okay, this slide pertains particularly to NAR MLS members, but really to all members of the brokerage community. You are participating in a cooperative industry. While you represent your client solely, maybe you're the listing broker representing the seller exclusively, and the buyer represents the buyer exclusively, and I absolutely expect both of you to adhere to every aspect of your duties of loyalty. You are still working cooperatively to try and get both of your clients to fulfill their goals of closing a transaction. And so NAR MLS brokers in particularly, if you are not the best team player when it comes to returning phone calls, responding to emails, text messages, you need to rethink your practices, because buyer brokers will be contacting you for information that is essential to their client. And it will be really lovely if, when a buyer broker contacts you and says, I need to know whether or not your seller is offering compensation. My buyer thinks they're interested in your seller's property, doesn't want to go view it unless they know that your seller is at least offering compensation. Listing brokers, you've got to get back to them timely and efficiently. If you are too busy to do that, hire an assistant. Buyer brokers, generally speaking, you're going to have to do a little more legwork and research than you've ever done before when you're showing properties. You are going to have to go to a listing broker's website potentially, or their social media, or pick up the phone and call them to find out what the seller is offering as compensation, if anything. And then this final bullet point, we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but I do think this is really important. Listing brokers, you should be ready to send over written confirmation to the buyer broker of what the seller's offer of compensation is. So that goes back to using either the addendum or the standalone offer of compensation with the 1A SWF, just to facilitate that outcome. Okay. Questions about anything we've talked about so far?
So Annie, I have a couple of questions from the class. I'll just read them really quickly and let you answer them if you want.
Okay, Stacy, is there any way possible for you to face the microphone and read the question at the same time?
Absolutely. Sure. Okay, first question is, if I have my own website that the data syndicates from MLS, can I put offer of compensation on there?
So I'm gonna start with saying I don't know anything about tech. I'm not tech savvy, and I'm not even sure I understand the question, but what I think I hear the question asking is, my website, read it again, which direction does the information flow to the website?
I can speak up, Annie, if you want. The information flows from MLS to my website. So it's not a brokerage website. It's a website I pay an outside vendor for that syndicates the information from Spokane MLS.
You cannot put it on there then.
I cannot put it on my website. Okay, thank you.
Nope, thank you. Stacy, what's the next one?
Which form should a listing agent use if we are members of both Northwest MLS and at NAR MLS?
And we've answered that one. I think that probably came in before we covered that slide.
Perfect. Would it be necessary to update listing agreement with the seller if the subject property is already pending?
No. So unless you have a sale fill, right? So if you have a listing agreement, a 1A SWF listing agreement, this property is already pending closing, you already got a purchase and sale agreement on that property, you do not need to replace the old 1A SWF with the new 1A SWF unless that sale fails and it goes back on the market. Then you would need to do that. Is that everything from you, Stacy?
From the chat, we have a couple of raised hands now.
Okay, perfect. Aisha.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was a little confused when you were saying the whole note part, or what the broker had to put into an area that we had to use the verbiage. Is that once you're under contract, or is this with the listing agreement?
So are you your firm's DB, Aisha?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you the designated broker in your firm?
No, I'm just a regular broker.
So you're not gonna have to worry about this then. This only pertains to the users of Form 1A SWF, so NAR MLS members, whose designated broker will provide language for the brokers to use when they're listing properties using Form 1A SWF and the seller wants to offer compensation. That's what I was talking about.
So that's where I'm just a little confused. So then if they do the verbiage and they put that into the document that you want us to use, that verbiage is already there, and then we just use that for the agreement?
So are you an NAR MLS member, Aisha?
I am not, actually.
You're a Northwest MLS member?
PAC MLS.
Okay, you are PAC MLS is an NAR MLS.
Okay, perfect.
So what you need to do, Aisha, is work with your firm's designated broker or your managing broker to answer this question. Because every firm is going to answer this question differently based on the language provided to its members for you to create an opportunity for the seller to offer compensation to the buyer broker. But this is going to be a firm-specific issue. You need to talk to your firm management.
Okay, then my second question to that, they have that figured out. They have all the wording. Do we need that additional to the PSA, or once the PSA is agreed on with the compensation on there? So you need both?
Well, it's apples and oranges.
Okay,
What
perfect.
we're talking about is language that will be part of the listing agreement. It's tangentially related to what happens in the purchase and sale agreement, but not directly.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yep. Okay, Manesh.
Hi there, Northwest MLS here. Just thinking of our clients here. So they're still going to be using the Redfins or Zillows and whatever they do. Have you heard from the industry whether they're going to be able to pick up the right field in the Northwest MLS like they do today and still show the commission, or are they just going to flat out take the commissions away for the whole country?
I have no idea how any individual franchise is going to show listings on their websites. I don't have any idea.
Okay.
Yes,
Jessica. Jessica, I can't hear you. I mean, you're not muted. I can hear that you're saying something. You're just really quiet. Can you get closer to your microphone? Go ahead and try and ask, and I'll try and hear you. Okay, sounds good. Lou.
The last slide you showed, you said something about we need to present to the buyer side what what the selling side is willing to offer. Maybe it wasn't the last slide. Sorry, that doesn't look right. Anyway,
That's okay.
You're saying that we actually have to tell the buyer side how much the seller is willing to offer? We can't, because it seems like.
No.
Okay.
I'm suggesting that if the seller has made an offer of compensation to a buyer broker, they have said, I will pay 5 chocolate truffles to a buyer broker, and the buyer broker calls you and asks, has the seller made an offer of compensation to the buyer broker? Then yes, you must communicate that to the buyer broker. If the seller has said, well, don't tell the buyer broker, I'd probably be willing to pay up to 5 chocolate truffles, but I'd really rather just get an offer from them, then you're not going to answer that question when the buyer broker calls you.
Got it. Thank you.
Patty Hill Day.
Hi, Annie. Thank you for doing this. So I was thinking, should my seller say, I'm gonna offer 0 compensation because I want to know what the buyer and their broker have agreed on, and maybe I'll pay that. I don't want to offer 3% if they've only agreed to 2.5%.
Yeah, every seller needs to make that decision for themselves. Every listing broker needs to be prepared to have that conversation with their seller. It comes across in a different marketing way to a buyer broker if seller offers compensation or they don't. So listing brokers need to be prepared to have that conversation with sellers so that sellers are empowered to answer that question for themselves. There is absolutely no right or wrong answer to that question.
Well, thanks.
Yep, Doug. Doug, you're muted. I can't hear you. Okay, Doug, I'm gonna let you work on that. What's your question? Oh, there, Doug's, just a second, Jessica, go ahead, Doug.
Okay, you mentioned that we could hire an assistant to answer the compensation question. Would they have to be licensed to talk compensation?
Well, all of the listing, if you have an assistant who answers the phone for you anyway, and they're reading information off of a printed page, unlicensed assistants are allowed to do that.
Okay, cool, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Jessica.
So people have kind of mentioned this, and so what we did in our paperwork is we actually have in our buyer broker compensation for the listing, we've added a thing where it basically says, seller, you're giving me permission to disclose this in advertising and however, so that we're getting explicit, because I can see somebody saying, well, I'll pay up to 5 chocolate truffles, but I don't want to tell anybody that, because what if they come at 2 chocolate truffles? I don't want to show my cards. So we've just put a provision in there that, and I just want to make sure that was okay, that basically says, you're giving us permission or you're not giving us permission to advertise or disclose that.
So Jessica is a member of an NAR MLS asking this question. So what you're describing is the language that your firm has already created for sellers to offer compensation. And one of the things that you thought was important to include in that provision was sellers' authorization to publish the offer of compensation in whatever venue you're going to publish it in. Absolutely, that's a great idea. If your language includes that, that's great. Terry.
Hi, Annie. If your firm creates an additional addendum that states the buyer's broker compensation being offered, can those forms be kept on file, and the receptionist and or managing broker of the office forward that to somebody if they request it and you're not available to send it to them?
Yes. Yeah. So if it's some kind of a standalone form that other than the listing agreement itself that you could forward, that somebody could forward, there's no reason why an unlicensed assistant or an unlicensed person can't forward that information at the request of a buyer broker, so long as your firm's policy instructs that to happen. Deb.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Deb.
Can you see me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I can't see me. So I'm confused about why an addendum is okay if we're not supposed to include it in the listing agreement.
The MLS can't include it in the listing agreement. The collective association of brokers cannot put it into the listing agreement. But when the seller wants to offer compensation to the buyer broker, that means that the listing firm is going to have to provide the language for the seller to do that. The industry is not saying to sellers, you can't offer compensation. The industry is saying that there can't be through this collective body any kind of an industry protocol regarding collection or payment of compensation. So it's going to happen at the individual level between the seller and the listing firm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Kimberly.
Hi, Annie. Are you going to go over 7B with buyer to request compensation on offer? And what about variable compensations with Form 7F?
No, I'm not planning on spending any more time on 7B than I already have. But there is that checkbox provision that you referenced, which is a new checkbox that seller can leave blank any specified amount of compensation using 1A 7B and mark the box instead. That will populate to a field in the MLS printout showing exactly that seller is willing to consider paying compensation buyer bring an offer. James.
Oh, yes. Hi, Annie. So I know that I got on here probably about 2-3 minutes late, but I'm pretty sure you did answer this already, just to confirm the.
James, you just froze. I can't hear your question.
Oh, because I'm actually in MLS and also Northwest MLS, and then also another multiple MLS also. Do I actually have to get 3 separate listing agreements, one for each?
You're going to have to get a separate listing agreement for Northwest MLS and for your NAR MLS. I don't know what other listing, I don't know that you're going to have 3 because I don't know what the other MLS could possibly be. But you will have to have 2 separate listing agreements for Northwest MLS and your NAR MLS.
Okay, and the other one is NY MLS.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. Carrie.
Okay, thank you.
So if your firm has a separate form for that offer of compensation, can you upload that as part of the supplements, or do you have to just send that out upon request?
You cannot attach it in any way, shape, or form to the MLS listing. So
Great,
your
thanks.
NAR MLS listing. Yep. Dorothy.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So did you say that we couldn't include offer of compensation on sites like realtor.com, Zillow, homes.com? It can't, because they pull all their information from the MLS, so we can't put anything like that in any of those websites.
If you're an NAR MLS member, that is absolutely correct.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Aaron.
Hi, Annie, can you hear me?
I can.
You quite succinctly started this out saying that you were not going to talk about the commissions as a percentage, instead talk about truffles because we're among competitors. When I'm teaching this class, can I use a percentage in my building as long as it's just my brokers?
I don't think it's a good idea. You're even when you're teaching to your firm of brokers, each one of them is an independent contractor. They are competitors with one another. I would never do it. It's just not a good idea and it's not necessary. When you have a broker in your office and you're one-on-one with that broker, certainly. And you as the designated broker have every right to create a minimum commission that your firm will accept, and it can be in the form of percentages and dollar values. It doesn't have to be in chocolate truffles. So you can establish that for your firm and you can communicate that to your firm. But when you're talking about specific percentages or dollars that any individual broker might charge, you should do that one-on-one only. Michelle.
Hey there. Okay, so with Patty and Jessica's comments about sellers offering one amount and buyer agency agreement being a different amount, say sellers offering 10 chocolates, buyer agency agreement says 5 chocolates. I've seen and heard lots of chatter that the difference in that, if seller is offering 10 but buyer agency agreement only says 5, does that difference go to the listing firm? That's what I've seen a lot of chatter about. Is that accurate?
No, Michelle, if you would hang on to that until the next section, we're going to cover that when we talk about buyer brokerage agreements.
Perfect.
Marty.
So I'm not seeing it now, but a minute ago, I found the answer to my question in 7B, but now I can't see it. But regardless, isn't it true that regardless of what the seller puts out into the universe, a buyer with their broker can come offer anything they want, any version, any
Yes.
extra?
Absolutely.
I think it's good. I think it's a good education
Okay.
to our sellers.
Perfect timing. It's 2:00 straight up. I don't see any more questions. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. I will start talking at 2:10. Go ahead and everybody else take a break. Lauren, I'm going to stick around and answer your question before I go. If you want to hear Lauren's question and answer, then stick around. Otherwise, you're free to go take a break for 10 minutes and I'll start talking again at 2:10. Lauren, go ahead. Lauren, are you there?
Yes, thank you. When we're reviewing offers on the list side, are we permitted to ask for a buyer representation agreement? And or as a buyer's agent, are we allowed to provide that in a fiduciary duty perspective?
Yeah, I think I covered this in the next section, but I'll tell you just really quickly that I've seen social media chatter about how buyer brokers should not provide their buyer brokerage services agreement to a listing broker. I don't get it. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't. I understand that some sellers who are being asked to pay that compensation may want proof that the buyers actually really agreed to pay that compensation to a buyer broker. And I don't know what harm there comes to a buyer or a buyer broker by sharing that buyer broker services agreement with a listing broker. I do not think you should attach it to every purchase and sale agreement that you send to a seller. But if a seller or a listing broker requests it, I don't know why you wouldn't share it. And I think I will probably repeat that in the next section.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, Annie. Really quick question. So pertaining to Lauren's, what she just asked you, in our office class that we took yesterday, it was actually quite the opposite, that our DB told us that the listing broker can actually request the buyer broker agreement. And if we have written the buyer brokerage amount less, then they can just lower the price. I mean, lower the percentage, I apologize.
So,
or is that just?
This is not a legal issue. What you're saying is that you have a BBSA for 5 chocolate truffles, and on your purchase and sale agreement, you write 10 chocolate truffles, and before seller agrees to that, they ask for a copy of your BBSA, you send it over, it said only 5 chocolate truffles. That seller then has the automatic right or something like that to reduce the amount of compensation. You're still at that point, you're still in a negotiation, so they can negotiate whatever they want. You guys can agree or not agree. But what we're going to talk about in the next section is that you're prohibited as a broker from taking any more compensation than what the buyer is agreed to pay.
Right, but can the listing broker request that BBSA?
Absolutely.
Okay, so they can do that. Okay, thank you.
Terry.
When you're talking about buyer's agency agreements given to listing agents, I've had 2 separate instances where listing agents waited out the expiration of whatever I had sent them in the process. One of them leased a property out to my buyer and let him live in it for 6 months and wait until all of my stuff expired and then sold it to him. I can see where, you wouldn't want to give a buyer's agency agreement to listing brokers if it wasn't somebody you didn't really trust.
Or if there's information that you don't want to share, that you black that out, you redact that information and send it over. Because what they really are wanting to know and needing to know is has buyer really agreed to pay you the amount of compensation that is being negotiated in the purchase agreement. They don't need to know how long they don't need to know the exclusivity, non-exclusivity, the geographical area, the length of the contract. They don't need to know any of that. So if you want to redact all that, I have no problem with that.
Well, so if my agreement with my buyer is 3 chocolate boxes and they're offering 5, well, I can't take that anyway, so I guess it doesn't really matter. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. John?
Hello, if the buyer broker, is only trying to get, is offered 1%,
We're not using percentages or dollar values.
okay, if they're only offered one truffle,
Yeah.
can the seller not give them one truffle, but raise the price of the house like we used to do for covering closing costs?
So, it's important to remember that all terms of the purchase and sale agreement are gonna be negotiable.
Okay,
Are you in the Northwest MLS, John, or are you in an NAR MLS?
I'm in the Northwest MLS.
So your listing agreement, Form 1A, has a provision in it which says that any offer of compensation the seller makes cannot be withdrawn or modified for up to 3 days after buyer indicates an intention to make an offer on the property.
Yeah.
So if the seller had offered a chocolate truffle at a list price of $200,000 and the buyer makes an offer at $200,000, the seller would likely be in violation of their listing agreement if at that point they said, well, for $200,000, you want a chocolate truffle, I'm gonna raise the price by one chocolate truffle in order to make that work. Then the seller's probably gonna be in breach of their listing agreement.
Makes you think of that because, you know, when buyers wanted closing costs, we would raise the price of the house 10 grand, you know, so.
Yeah, but that's because the seller hadn't offered to pay closing costs as part of their listing. When a seller signs a Form 1A and offers compensation to the buyer, they're making that as part of their listing agreement with the listing firm. I'm making this as an offer of compensation to a buyer broker. Unless they've made an offer of payment of buyer broker's closing costs, which they never do, then it's apples and oranges.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Harriet.
So if I'm a member of Northwest MLS and an NAR agency, and in the future get a new listing and have to fill out 2 listing forms, do I then have the seller offer only half as many chocolate truffles as normal?
No.
Thinking that, you know,
that's why I'm saying, yeah, that's why I'm saying, and I suspect that you're talking only about the listing firm compensation, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So are you the designated broker of your firm, Harriet?
No.
So your designated broker needs to create some kind of a document that your seller can rely upon as assurance that they will not be obligated to pay the listing firm 2 sets of listing firm compensation twice. That's going to be something your designated broker comes up with. You don't need to come up with that.
Yeah, I guess I don't mean that. What I'm thinking is that if the seller now is not obligated to pay the buyer brokerage, then would they assume that they can put their listing commission down and then cover buyer brokerage if it's
Harriet, I can't tell you what any seller is going to assume, but I can tell you that the listing agreement, 1A and 1A SWF, makes very clear that the seller is going to pay compensation identified in paragraph 7A to the listing firm upon the listing firm's performance of the contract. That's what their obligation is to pay. If they think that that's negotiable because they misunderstand the contract, I can't explain that to you. But the contract is very clear that when the listing firm performs, they will be entitled to collect the compensation identified in paragraph 7A.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right.
I don't know how to raise my hand, but I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Jill.
Thank you. I was just wondering, okay, on our lock boxes, can we give any kind of compensation information?
No.
Okay.
Your lockbox or showing time or anything like that, scheduling programs are all fed by the MLS. You can't include it in that either.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, everybody, let's move forward in the materials. There's still some hands up, a couple new hands. I think John and Sarah, your hands might still be up. Madeline and Timothy, I'll catch you at the next question asking time. You're welcome to just keep your hands up if you want to. Let's go ahead and talk about buyer brokerage services agreements, Form 41. The Form 41 looks substantially different after August 15th than it does today. And so in your materials, you have the revised Form 41. That's what we're going to focus on. The biggest changes come to paragraphs 5 and 6. So that's where we're going to focus our conversation. You will have a buyer brokerage services agreement that says to the buyer, Form 41, it says to the buyer, the amount of compensation you will owe me is, and you're going to fill in the blank to create that amount, and under no circumstances will I, as your broker, collect any more compensation than this. You are making a representation to your buyer that you will not collect compensation from any other source in an amount greater than the amount that's been agreed, including the seller or the listing firm or anybody else. So if you agree with the buyer that you are going to receive 5 chocolate truffles and the seller offers 6 chocolate truffles, you only get 5 chocolate truffles. We'll talk more in a little bit about what happens to that other chocolate truffle, but you are absolutely limited to the amount of compensation you can collect based on the amount of compensation that you and the buyer have agreed in Form 41, paragraph 5. Now, Form 41, paragraph 5 does allow you to identify 3 different amounts of compensation depending on how the seller is represented. If you look at Form 41, the revised Form 41, paragraph 5, you'll see that the first place where you will write the amount of compensation is the spot that says if seller is represented. So if the seller is represented, your compensation will be what you write in that first blank. In the second blank, you will write the amount of compensation that you will receive in exchange for buyer broker services. So your buyer broker compensation, if you, buyer broker, are a limited dual agent. So if you are both the listing agent and the buyer's agent, you can write a different amount of compensation in Form 41, paragraph 5. And then in the third blank provision, you will write the amount of compensation you will receive as the buyer broker if the seller is unrepresented. Again, buyer, there is the presumption that if the seller is unrepresented, I will take on greater liability as your broker and I will have more work to do as your broker. So if the seller is unrepresented, if you want to buy a FSBO, I'll receive 7 chocolate truffles instead of 5, for example. Again, there's no right or wrong way to fill out that provision. You can make every number exactly the same. You can make all of them different. But I do want you to be aware of one thing. Let's say that it is your intention to receive 5 chocolate truffles for representing when you represent a seller. And it is also your intention to receive 5 chocolate truffles when you represent a buyer. And perhaps you are willing, if you are a limited dual agent, to take less than a total of 10 chocolate truffles. Let's say you would be willing to take 7.5 chocolate truffles. Think through this for a second. If on your listing agreement, you complete your listing agreement, paragraph 7A, whichever listing agreement you're using, 1A or 1ASWF, if you complete paragraph 7A to say that if you're a dual agent, as your listing firm compensation, you'll take only 2.5%. You'll only take, shoot, I screwed that up. You want 5 chocolate truffles. If you're willing to say, I'll take only 2.5 chocolate truffles as if I'm a dual agent. And then if you say the same thing on your buyer brokerage agreement, Form 41, paragraph 5, if you say, look, if I'm a dual agent buyer, I will take just 2.5 chocolate truffles for my services buyer broker. When you put those together, you're not getting 7.5 chocolate truffles, you're getting 5 chocolate truffles. So understand that when you fill out your listing agreement and your buyer brokerage services agreement, if you're trying to write the agreement so that your client gets a break. If you're a limited dual agent, be careful how you fill out those contracts, because if you give both the buyer and the seller the same break, you're getting less overall compensation than maybe what you intended. Just think through that so you understand what I just said.
Can you repeat it one more time?
Yeah. Both the listing agreement, form paragraph 7A of your listing agreement, whether it's 1A or 1A SWF, allows you to modify the compensation your firm will receive if you are a limited dual agent effectively. And the buyer agency agreement allows you to create a different level of compensation that you'll receive if you're a limited dual agent as the buyer broker. If you have a custom, if it's your custom to create your agency agreement with your seller, and also your custom to create your agency agreement with your buyer, intending to give both of them a break if you're a limited dual agent. And let's say that what you intended to collect for your listing services was 5 chocolate truffles, and from your buyer broker services, 5 chocolate truffles. That's just the compensation rate you charge, whether you're representing a buyer or a seller. But you would give your buyer a break, let's say, and charge only 2.5 chocolate truffles if you're a limited dual agent. If you made the same adjustment on both your listing firm and on your listing agreement and your buyer agency agreement, then at closing, you're not going to get 7.5 chocolate truffles. You put those 2.5 and 2.5 together, you're going to get 5 chocolate truffles and not 7.5. So I'm just saying, be careful. Think through the ultimate outcome when you're filling out a listing agreement and when you're filling out a buyer agency agreement, because you will necessarily always have both if you're a limited dual agent. So if your goal is to give one a concession and not the other so that you end up with something in the middle, then just create a practice that says, you're always going to charge your listing clients, your sellers this, and should a buyer come along who wants to purchase your seller's listing, that's who you're going to give the break to. It ultimately all comes out maybe the same. Just understand the operation of the forms so that you know how to fill in those provisions. And then once again, I'm going to just say this again because the bullet point is on the slide. Whatever number you and the buyer agree in paragraph 5 of your form 41 is the amount of compensation you can receive. You cannot take more. You can always take less by modifying or amending your buyer agency agreement. So if you're not listening, wake up and pay attention to what I'm about to say, because you will care about what I'm about to say. Every contract can always be amended by the 2 parties to the contract. That includes a buyer brokerage services agreement. So if you have a buyer brokerage services agreement saying that you will be paid 5 chocolate truffles, and the buyer falls absolutely in love with property, and the most the seller will pay is 4 chocolate truffles, you can always agree to amend your BBSA to reduce the amount of truffles you'll receive, or the compensation you'll receive. The same is true if seller is offering 6 chocolate truffles, but you are going to have to amend your BBSA before the buyer enters the purchase and sale agreement with the seller. So if you and the buyer have agreed that you're going to be paid 5 chocolate truffles and the buyer falls madly in love with property where the seller is offering 6 chocolate truffles, and the buyer says, I'm happy for you to get all 6 of those chocolate truffles. I think you've done a great job for me. You should get those chocolate truffles. Then you must amend your Form 41, paragraph 5, to indicate that you will be paid 6 chocolate truffles before you write the buyer's offer for seller to pay you 6 chocolate truffles. So the BBSA can always be amended either direction. If you're intending to increase the amount of compensation you can collect based on what the seller has offered, then the buyer must agree to amend your BBSA before you write the offer for the buyer's purchase of seller's property, indicating that you will take that increased amount of compensation. All right, paragraph 6 of Form 41 is greatly streamlined from what it used to be. This used to be the complicated provision of Form 41. There are now no moving parts in paragraph 6 of Form 41 at all. There are no checkbox provisions at all. In large part because we no longer deal with the scenario where what should happen if the seller offers more compensation than the buyer broker is entitled to get. We used to have the middle section of paragraph 6 be a checkbox provision where you could mark a box that says if the seller is offered more than the buyer, I don't know what happened to my face, sorry about that. If the seller has offered more, okay, well, for whatever reason, my camera's not working, so sorry about that. If the seller has offered more than what the buyer is obligated to pay, paragraph 6 used to allow you to say that the overage would be paid to the firm. And even in the boilerplate provision that you could have marked that said any overage will be credited to the buyer, there was boilerplate language in that provision that says, unless buyer's lender won't allow it, in which case it will be paid to the firm. All of that language is gone because you can no longer accept any greater compensation than what the buyer has agreed to pay you. That allowed the streamlining of paragraph 6. So now paragraph 6 says all of the things that are identified in the bullet points on this screen that's in front of you. Seller may offer compensation, but they're not obligated to. If seller offers compensation, it will be identified on the purchase and sale agreement. Buyer, you can negotiate in the PSA for the seller to pay compensation. If the seller does not agree to pay all the compensation you owe, buyer, you are obligated to pay that amount at closing. And if seller does offer more compensation than the buyer owes, then buyer, you can negotiate with the seller as to what will happen with respect to that overage amount as part of your purchase and sale agreement negotiations. Another big change in the Form 41 is that there is no longer an opportunity for buyer to instruct buyer broker to filter listings. You used to be able, based on buyer's instructions through the form of a checkbox provision, you used to be able to allow buyer to instruct you to filter listings based on if the seller has offered compensation, and if so, the amount of compensation. And then you could filter listings based on whether or not the buyer even wanted you to present the listing information to the buyer in the first place, or also filter based on whether or not they wanted you to show those properties. You can no longer filter. And perhaps you hear that and you go, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. I was never the one who wanted to filter the listings. It was always the buyer, because the buyer does not want to find themselves in this place where they have fallen madly in love with property that they want to purchase, and now they can't because the seller has not offered compensation sufficient to pay the amount that the buyer owes. And so to avoid that outcome, the buyer is the one who has instructed me not to introduce them to properties that they may not be able to afford. I understand that mindset. I understand the motivation and that it comes from the buyer, but it can't happen going forward. So instead, you're going to have a real-time conversation with your buyer where you explain, buyer, I'm going to provide to you a listing printout for every property that I believe is suitable based on the criteria that you've given me. And I will also contact listing brokers for any property that you may be interested in where compensation is not either published in the MLS because you're in an NAR MLS, or that I have not otherwise been able to find. And buyer, then you're going to be in the driver's seat. If you owe me 5 chocolate truffles and we have no evidence that seller is offering compensation, then buyer, it will be up to you to tell me whether or not you want to view that property. And if you tell me that you want me to call the listing firm and say, will your seller pay? And the listing broker is instructed by their seller to hide the ball, bring me an offer and then I'll decide if I want to pay. Buyer, it will be up to you to say, I want to see that property or I don't. So the inability to filter listings is one more way to put all of the power in the buyer, put the buyer in the driver's seat on all of these questions. buyer, I'm gonna give you all of the facts that I know about this property, everything in the MLS printout, plus any other information I've been able to obtain, and then you tell me whether or not you want to see the property. And if you see the property and you fall in love with it and you want to write an offer, then I will use all of the best negotiation skills I can bring to negotiate the outcome you're trying to achieve. But you will know everything that I know before we walk across the threshold of that home. Every broker, every Realtor member must update their Form 41 for any active buyers. So if you have a buyer who is actively looking for property and you're using a Form 41 with a revision date prior to August 24, whether you're a Northwest MLS member or an NAR MLS member, you must update your Form 41 to eliminate the ability to take compensation greater than the amount that the buyer has agreed. No questions. You have to update your Form 41. If your buyer is already in a pending transaction, you do not need to update your Form 41 unless that sale fails and your buyer starts to look for property again. When must the buyer brokerage services agreement be signed? Some folks are viewing the NAR settlement agreement as creating a conflicting provision with Washington law. In fact, I don't think there is any conflict at all. If there is a scenario where there is truly a conflict between the NAR requirement and the existing Washington law, then Washington law trumps every single time. Washington law will always control the outcome if there is a conflict. I don't believe you're going to find a conflict in almost any scenario. The NAR Code of Ethics requirement is that you must enter a buyer brokerage services agreement with a buyer to whom you are providing brokerage services before you tour any homes with that buyer. Washington law says that you must enter a buyer brokerage services agreement with a buyer before you provide any real estate brokerage services. And if that isn't possible, then as soon as reasonably practical after you commence to provide real estate brokerage services. So the difference is in nuance only. Let's apply it in some scenarios. Let's say that you are the recipient of that phone call from a buyer who says, hey, I want to see this property that's on the market. You don't know me, I don't know you, but I found this property that's interesting. I called your firm, maybe you're on floor, maybe the call got routed to you. Can you meet me at this property? Or maybe you get a referral from some referral source that a buyer wants to meet you at 1313 Mockingbird Lane to see the home. Some of you will interpret Washington law to say, I've kind of got a one house fudge factor. I could go meet that buyer at that first house based on Washington law alone and show that house to that buyer. And then if they wanted to move forward, or if they wanted me to show them something else, then require they enter a brokerage services agreement with me. Some of you interpret Washington law that way. But the NAR rule now says that can't happen. If you are going to show a home, tour a home with a buyer to whom you're providing brokerage services, then you must enter a brokerage services agreement with that buyer before you cross the threshold of that home, which means that under the NAR requirement, you are going to show up at that house to meet the buyer, and you should let them know this in advance. But you are going to show up at that house. If you haven't already gotten their signature on a BBSA through AuthentiSign or some electronic signature format, then you're going to show up at the house and say, buyer, you got to sign this brokerage services agreement before we go through the house. Now, I'm not telling you that the brokerage services agreement has to be for a geographical area that covers the entire county. It could be that one address. I'm not telling you that it has to be for a year of length. It could be for whatever time period you want to make it. I'm not even telling you it has to be an exclusive contract. It could be non-exclusive. But the buyer must sign a brokerage services agreement with you before you tour that home under the NAR requirement. Now, how is that not in conflict with Washington law? Because Washington law also says that you must enter a brokerage services agreement before or as soon as reasonably practical thereafter. So you are consistent with both the NAR rule and Washington law if you require that buyer to sign the BBSA before you show them that house that you showed up on the doorstep to tour with them. Here's a different scenario. You're working with the buyer for a month before you ever tour a single home with them. And maybe they're out of state, but in this time period, you're sharing properties with them and you're advising them about the different properties. Here's the terms that this buyer is asking for. Here's what I think are really great marketing features about this property. Here's things that cause me some concern. You are advising and consulting with this buyer about a potential real estate transaction for a month before you ever tour a home with them. Based on Washington law, you are providing real estate brokerage services and you must have already entered a brokerage services agreement with that buyer, even though you haven't toured a home with them yet, even though the NAR provision has not yet triggered because you're not touring a home yet. So you have to enter a BBSA with that buyer maybe a month before you ever show them a home to be consistent with Washington law, which is also consistent with the NAR requirement because you are entering a brokerage services agreement with that buyer before touring a single home with them. So again, I don't think you're going to find many scenarios where you truly have a conflict. If you do, Washington law trumps. But more often than not, you're going to marry up those two requirements. How does all of that fit into an open house scenario? Let's start with the open house that is hosted by an agent of the seller. Might be the listing agent. It might be another broker who has become an agent of the seller. So it could be the person whose name is identified on the listing agreement as the seller's agent, or it could be somebody who's made an agent of the seller through an addendum to that listing agreement. But in any event, it is somebody, we're describing the host of the open house as somebody who already represents the seller. A buyer shows up to that open house, the seller's agent is free to tour that home with the buyer with no concern for entering a brokerage services agreement. Because you are touring the home with the buyer as the seller's agent, you already have a brokerage services agreement as required by Washington law with the seller, your client. You satisfy the NAR requirement because you are not touring the home with this buyer as the buyer's agent. You're touring the home as the seller's agent. So then let's look at a scenario where the host of the open house is not an agent of the seller. They do not represent the seller. Can that person, consistent with the NAR requirement, tour the home with the buyer? NAR has answered this question directly to say, yes, you can. You are not in conflict with the NAR requirement if, as the host of an open house, you tour the house with the buyer who comes through. Certainly that is consistent with Washington law, which says before or as soon as reasonably practical. I would submit that it is not practical that you will require a buyer to sign a brokerage services agreement when all the buyer wants to do is tour a publicized open house with you as the host of the open house. But that does lead to the next question. There are some brokers out there who are requiring buyers to sign brokerage services agreements when the buyer shows up at the open house. Is that lawful, is the next question. And the answer to that question is, it's not unlawful, but it is only lawful if you as the broker requiring the buyer to sign that brokerage services agreement are actually acting consistently with all of Washington law in gaining that signature. Have you provided the pamphlet? Have you truly represented the nature of the document you're asking the buyer to sign? Does the agreement you're asking the buyer to sign represent what it is that you create the contractual obligation that you have represented to the buyer? Is it fair to require the buyer to sign the buyer brokerage services agreement you're putting in front of them in order to simply tour the open house that you have publicized as an open house open to the public. We already know that Washington courts apply the Consumer Protection Act to the brokerage industry. So if a complaint is filed against you and it is found that you have engaged in unfair practices as they relate to a buyer, then you may be liable under the Consumer Protection Act. So while I would not say it's unlawful to have a buyer sign a brokerage services agreement at an open house, I do think it is impractical in most circumstances. Forms 40 and 40A. Before we leave the topic of buyer brokerage services agreements, I want to pick up this conversation. These two forms are not directly related to Form 41, but these two forms are absolutely integral to you being paid the compensation you're owed under Form 41. Buyer agrees that you're entitled to 5 chocolate truffles as their buyer broker under the buyer brokerage services agreement. And let's say you find yourself in a scenario where seller has only agreed to pay 3 of those chocolate truffles. And buyer says, that's okay, I really want this property. I will pay the remaining 2 chocolate truffles to you at closing. The question then becomes, how does the escrow agent know that the buyer is paying you 2 chocolate truffles at closing when there's nothing in the purchase and sale agreement, and there is nothing in the purchase and sale agreement saying that the buyer is going to pay you 2 chocolate truffles? The escrow agent only knows what it is that you have told the escrow agent. And Form 40A is your tool, your statewide forms tool for communicating to the escrow agent the compensation that buyer is going to pay you at closing. Let's start this conversation with Form 40, because many of you will be familiar with Form 40. Many of you will not be, and that's okay. I'm going to tell you why you're not. Form 40 is the statewide form, the Commission Disbursement Agreement, and you are familiar with Form 40 if 2 things are true. If you are the one responsible for submitting to escrow the instructions that let escrow know compensation that's being paid by the seller or the buyer to the brokers in the transaction. If you are the person within your firm who is responsible for communicating that to escrow, then you're, and the form that you use for communicating that information is statewide Form 40, then you're familiar with Form 40. You are not familiar with Form 40 if somebody else in your firm communicates that information to escrow, and many firms have that protocol. Many firms have a protocol that says somebody else on the team, or the office manager, or the designated broker themselves will always communicate with escrow the compensation requirement that escrow will then use to put on the settlement statement. Or you're responsible for communicating that information yourself, but we have our own internal form that our firm or our franchise uses. We don't use Form 40. So in either of those scenarios, you still might be communicating the commission the instructions to the escrow agent and not be familiar with Form 40. I don't care if you're familiar with Form 40 or not. All of this is lead in to explaining Form 40A, because Form 40 is the form that you use if you're using the statewide forms to communicate seller's obligation to pay compensation. And when an escrow agent receives Form 40, what the escrow agent knows is that they are going to complete the settlement statement showing in seller's column compensation payment to the listing firm and potentially compensation payment to the buyer broker firm. If the buyer is the party paying compensation and you are using the statewide forms to put escrow on notice of that fact, Form 40A is the form you're going to use. It is in your materials provided to you today. Form 40A will almost always be completed by the buyer broker, and it will tell the escrow agent to put the identified amount of compensation in the buyer's column as payment to the buyer broker. You should deliver the Form 40A to escrow as soon as escrow is opened. And this is the pushback I get oftentimes. Brokers say, well, I never, or whoever it is who within your firm who's responsible for delivering the commission disbursement agreement, they say, we never deliver that form to escrow more than a week or two before closing, because sometimes the amount of compensation that the firm is going to get paid changes over the course of the transaction. We'll negotiate the inspection contingency, and all of a sudden I'm getting less compensation than I was originally. So why would I communicate to escrow when we open escrow when that number could change? The reason is because it takes less than 5 minutes to communicate that information to escrow, and escrow needs to know that information. Because particularly when a buyer may be paying buyer broker's compensation, not only does escrow need to know that, but so does buyer's lender. And when you educate escrow at the opening of escrow with the amount of compensation the buyer is going to have to bring to the closing table, there's a communication that happens behind the scene that most of us are never familiar with. In almost every transaction, when the buyer makes loan application, buyer's lender reaches out to escrow and says, tell me about the closing costs that buyer's going to have to pay. Because lender has to have that information from escrow in order to be able to complete the loan disclosure that the lender is required to deliver to the buyer. If the escrow has the information saying buyer's going to have to pay 3 chocolate truffles to the buyer broker, escrow will communicate that to lender, and you will know from the outset if buyer's got an underwriting problem with that requirement. And maybe it's not even a prohibition by the underwriter. Maybe now all of a sudden we have a problem with buyer's funds availability. Maybe all of a sudden buyer doesn't have enough funds to pay those 3 chocolate truffles and have enough in reserve to get the financing. Wouldn't you rather know that now than later, than at closing? So deliver your communication, your commission disbursement agreement to escrow when escrow is open, whether seller is paying the compensation or buyer is paying the compensation. That cannot be overstated. Okay, Mindy, you've been very patient. What's on your mind?
Okay, sorry to beat a dead horse, but I just need to clarify because Doug and I will be going over things in our office with the brokers in regards to the amounts. So to make it really easy, I wanted to ask you a simple question. On the BBSA number 5, A, B, or C, are these the amounts that are only the buyer's side portion? I know A is, but is B buyer's side portion only, or is it the total compensation
Buyer side
for the
only.
limited dual agent?
Buyer side only.
Okay.
Is that it?
And also to clarify, yep, that's it. I got the other one perfect.
Okay, Kyle.
So if we have a BBSA with our buyer for a certain percentage, seller's offering more compensation in the listing than what we have with our buyers in the BBSA, can I use the 41A prior to writing the offer to increase my compensation to what the seller is offering in the listing?
As long as it's before you write the offer.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, Lisa.
When you were talking about the BBSA paragraph 6 and 8, you were saying the checkboxes were no longer there, but I just printed out the January 2024. You're talking about after the 15th, they will no longer be there?
That's right. I'm talking about the revised Form 41 that will be released for use on August 15th. It is in your materials right now with a big sample watermark across the face of it.
Thank you.
Yep. Karen. Karen, if you're talking, I can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you. So if we're showing property the week, let's say this coming weekend for the first time to a buyer, so prior to showing it, I would assume, and please clarify if you can, that I would use the current BBSA, and then next week when the new one comes into effect, have them sign that one. So have them sign this one and then have them sign another one next week. Is that correct?
That's right, because the new one's not available for you to use yet.
Correct. Okay, thank you.
Yep, welcome, Jessica. You're muted, Jessica.
I'm curious because I've gotten this already as we've actually put together an addendum to the buyer brokerage services agreement for the people that are already currently have that agreement. And what if we get no response from a buyer? My brokers are asking me what could come back on them if they're trying to modify, and that would go for a listing or for a buyer. And, it's now the 18th and they haven't modified that.
Yeah.
Is there any consequence?
Well, the two agreements are different. So yes, I mean, if your seller doesn't modify the listing agreement, then you have a contract with your seller to perform an impossible task, because your listing agreement will say that seller has instructed you to offer this compensation through the MLS to a buyer broker. You can't do that. And so if the seller won't modify the agreement, you're now in an impossible contract, which has legal significance that I'm going to tell you have to talk to your firm's lawyer about. If the buyer doesn't update their buyer agency agreement, then again, I'm going to tell you that you need to talk to your firm's lawyer, but now you don't have an impossible contract. You just have a contract that the buyer is authorizing you to do something that your NAR rules won't allow you to do, your ethics rules won't allow you to do. So there would probably be a different approach from your firm's lawyer with respect to that issue than the listing agreement, but both of those are issues that you're going to have to take up with your firm's legal counsel.
Can I make two additional comments?
Can you hold comments rather than questions? Aisha, go ahead.
I know we kind of went over this, but I just want clarification. When amending the higher rate, you said before, does that mean like a day before, or how does? Where does that fall?
Like 10 minutes before. I don't care.
Okay,
how long
perfect.
Before.
Okay, because we just had a miscommunication in our office where he said that you cannot do that. So that's why I wanted just clarification on that. So I'm glad that we could amend it. My next thing is BBSAs with Zillow calls. I know that there's I'm a little confused between Washington law and NAR law. When I get a Zillow call, it's really hard. I mean, I've never met these people. So to just be like, you have to sign a BBSA, you're telling me that I can just meet them there once it feels right, have them sign it. I just can't show them any houses moving forward from that time.
That is not what I said.
Okay,
I said
sorry.
you can meet them there, but before you show them that property, they must sign a BBSA. Now,
Okay.
the BBSA could be for that property only. It could be for 1 day of duration. It could be a non-exclusive agreement.
Okay.
Which would make it a really harmless agreement for them to sign. I'm not saying it has to be that. It could be more or less than that. It's up to you and the buyer to negotiate that. But you cannot show them that property without having a BBSA negotiated with them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And you should tell them that before you show up at the property. Because if they say there's no way in God's green earth I'm signing that with you, then don't waste your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Pamela.
Thank you, Annie. What document, of any, do we need to sign if we're being a cooperative listing agent and showing property to a buyer on behalf of another buyer broker?
So in your scenario, you are the listing broker.
Correct. And I'm in a rural area. This happens frequently. People say,
Yeah, so I get it. I understand your fact pattern, but the essential element here is you're the listing broker. And a buyer broker has called you and said, would you do a courtesy showing to my buyer? You don't need anything else because you already have a brokerage services agreement with your client in the transaction. Your client is the seller. You can show 100 buyers a day your seller's listing without any kind of a brokerage services agreement because your services agreement is with your seller, your client.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, Manesh.
Hi, going back to buyer brokerage agreements, I completely understand if seller is offering buyer truffles and our buyer brokerage says 3, we can amend that to go up. Understand that. But something you said earlier was the other way around. So seller is offering fewer chocolate truffles than our buyer brokerage. And you said we must get the form changed. Do we have to, if we as buyer brokers are happy to just take the lower number, do we have to change our buyer brokerage agreement?
your firm might require that you change your buyer broker agreement, and a lot of firms will say it's best practices that you change your buyer broker agreement just so that the buyer can be completely clear. And when the DOL auditor comes through your firm and they look and they do a comparison, they can see exactly the same two numbers. For me to say you absolutely have to would be me saying I think that you're gonna cheat your buyer if you don't do it in writing, and I don't think anybody I know in this industry would do that. Which is why I'm happy to say in a more laissez-faire way, yeah, no, you don't really have to amend it if all you're taking is less compensation. But I do think that if I actually said that out loud in this class, there are many designated brokers in this class who would then be sending me an email later saying, why on earth did you say that? And I also do think you could be creating a practice that results in DOL audit issues that you don't want. So the best practice is, whether it's an absolute contractual necessity or not, the best practice is that you modify your brokerage services agreement, even if you're taking less compensation than what you and the buyer had originally agreed.
Thank you.
Yep, Jennifer. I can't hear you, Jennifer. You're unmuted, but I still can't hear you.
Okay.
Oh, now I could. Go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yeah.
My question is along those same lines. If you have a buyer broker, if you have an agreement with the buyer for 90 days, it's just a blanket one, and you're asking for 5 chocolates, they find a house for 4, you do an addendum, can it be just for that house? Or if the seller gets the offer, do you have to go back and re-up?
Nope. You can amend your buyer agency agreement to say for 1313 Mockingbird Lane, buyer will compensate for 4 chocolate truffles.
Thank you.
Not for any other property. Absolutely. Margot.
Your buyer brokerage agreement is giving you 6 truffles. The property that you have written an offer for your client is paying 5. At escrow is a 40 delivered by the seller for the 5 truffles, and then a 40A from me, buyer broker, for the 6th truffle. Is that how that would work?
Typically, that's how that works. Typically, the listing firm delivers the escrow instructions notifying about what the seller is paying, but you should make sure that that was delivered. It will always be up to you to deliver escrow instructions for what the buyer is paying you, the buyer broker. Rhonda.
In a situation where I'm a listing agent and we have the 1A and then end up meeting a buyer who wants to buy the house and do the BBSA, the Form 41, and in both cases we sign the limited dual agency, do I then go to a Form 47 and just say it's a deal between these two off market, and then we just do it that way? And if we do that, does it supersede the other 2 documents?
So Rhonda, I'm not understanding your question at all. I thought you said originally that you have a listing agreement with the seller already in place, and then you sign a buyer agency agreement with the buyer, a Form 41, correct? What you would never in that scenario sign a Form 47. You already represent the seller and you already represent the buyer. You also said that both have consented to you being a limited dual agent. Those are the only 2 agency agreements you're going to have in that transaction.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Kathy.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify on the statement you made that if the selling broker has someone call and say they want to see the house, if they don't have a buyer's broker, can you still show, you were saying 100 times a day if you want, or do they have to have a buyer's broker?
No. And we're talking about a scenario where the broker who's getting the phone call is the listing broker, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the listing broker has an unrepresented buyer contact them to see the property. Mm-hmm. Listing broker can go show that property as the seller's exclusive agent. The listing broker does not need a buyer brokerage services agreement with that buyer. And in fact, if the listing broker signed a buyer brokerage services agreement with that buyer, they would change entirely the nature of their relationship to the seller. They would no longer be the seller's exclusive agent. They would now be a limited dual agent. So the listing broker should not sign a brokerage services agreement with an unrepresented buyer unless it is their intent, compliant with their seller's consent, to actually become a dual agent.
And if that selling broker, put me down as a person that can show the property, do I have to get a buyer's broker? A
So now
BB.
we're talking about a scenario where somebody else in your firm is the listing broker, but you're not. But maybe
I'm
you're
not.
the team, you're not the listing broker, but the listing broker has asked you to go show them, meet this buyer at the property and show them. Yes, you have to have a brokerage services agreement with that buyer before you show them the house.
So, yeah, I just hate the fact that I'm going on a blind date and then I'm asking for a premium, no matter if it's for one night or not. But
tell it to the DOJ.
I know. I don't know how we can change that to have at least a grace period.
You can't. Jill, go. Kathy, I need to move on. Jill, go ahead.
Okay, I think you answered this, but it went over my head, and that is, say, the selling broker, or excuse me, the seller offers 5 chocolate truffles, and my buyer brokerage agreement's 4. I want that extra truffle, and you talked about it being, where do we put that?
So you can amend your buyer brokerage services agreement using a Form 41A. Using Form 41A, you and the buyer can agree that you will receive, using your example, I can't remember what your example was, 5 chocolate truffles instead of 4. You can amend your original buyer brokerage services agreement using the 41A, so long as you do that before you write the offer for the buyer, then you can take the compensation that the seller is offered, even if it's more than what you had originally agreed with the buyer.
Okay, and that gets presented to them to show them that.
Doesn't get presented to, okay, so let's have this conversation. So Jill.
Yes, thank you.
This is, Stacy, this is a slide I need to add into the materials after today, because I don't have this slide. Maybe I do in the next section. Here's the question. When a listing broker says to a buyer broker, send me a copy of your BBSA, my seller doesn't believe that anybody really agreed to pay you 6 chocolate truffles. My seller's only offering 2 chocolate truffles, and you're telling me your buyer agreed to pay you 6 chocolate truffles, and you've asked for 6 chocolate truffles, and my seller thinks that's crazy. So send us a copy of your BBSA showing that your buyer really agreed to pay you 6 chocolate truffles. The question is, can the buyer broker send it? Should the buyer broker send it? And then whatever other question might flow from there. Can the listing broker even ask for that? So the answer to the last question first is, yeah, listing broker can absolutely ask for that. Listing broker's question should originate with the seller, or at least the listing broker should ask the seller, do you want me to ask for confirmation? But when the seller wants to see that and you're in the throes of negotiating a purchase and sale agreement that includes that term, then it probably behooves your buyer to prove that information to the seller. Nevertheless, when you as the buyer broker get that question, get that request from the listing broker, your first question should be to the buyer. Buyer, is it okay with you if I send over a copy of the buyer brokerage services agreement? And I expect 95% of the buyers out there to say, I don't care. And I expect 95% of the buyer brokers out there to say, there's nothing about this agreement that's secret in my opinion. But there was a question asked a few minutes ago during the break period. Somebody said, I've had a bad experience getting my buyer brokerage services agreement in the past, because once the parties on the other side of this transaction learned that my buyer brokerage services agreement was going to expire however many days in the future, they just waited me out. So maybe before you deliver your buyer brokerage services agreement, if you have that concern, then maybe you redact the information associated with the term of your buyer brokerage services agreement, or the geographical scope of your buyer brokerage services agreement, or whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive, because none of that is relevant to the seller's inquiry of, did your buyer really agree to pay 6 chocolate truffles? So if the seller needs that information in order to substantiate the negotiations that you're having over the purchase and sale agreement, then my response is, by all means, send it. But you should definitely have your buyer's permission first. Okay, Lisa.
So you may have answered this with Kathy. I'm on a team, and so I open doors and I also do open houses. Am I covered under the team leaders agreement, or do I have to do my own?
I don't know what your team leaders agreement says, but I'm not familiar with any team leaders agreement that can form an agency relationship between the seller and any team member. It would have to be an agreement signed by the seller. So unless the seller has made you an agent of the seller by signing probably an amendment to the listing agreement, then you are not the seller's agent. And if you're gonna meet somebody at the property, you're gonna be the buyer's agent, and you're gonna have to have a BBSA signed.
And when I'm holding the open house, anybody that, then I'm a buyer's agent too, because I'm not the listing agent.
That's correct. That's correct. You'll be a buyer's agent.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna take one more question and then we're gonna take a 5-minute break. So Sandy, go ahead.
Question is, I'm the listing broker. A buyer calls me and starts peppering me with questions. And asking me to send them information documents. Do you have a preliminary title? Send me the seller disclosure. At what point am I crossing over the line and be acting as providing buyer brokerage services without an agreement?
So,
How
okay,
much am I allowed to do?
let's be really, 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 really clear here, you guys. I thought I'd said this 100 times, but I keep getting the same question from, and it's not just Sandy. I've gotten this from others also. So Sandy, I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm picking on you. I'm not.
That's okay.
When you are the listing agent, you never have to have a brokerage services agreement with any buyer for that property. I don't care what the buyer's asking of you. When you have a listing agreement in place with a seller, you are the seller's exclusive agent and you can give every ounce of information conceivable to any buyer who comes along. You can show a buyer the same property, that you can show that same buyer the property 50 times. You're doing it as the seller's agent and you don't need a BBSA unless you choose to become a limited dual agent. Okay, we're taking a 5-minute break. Sorry, Amanda, hang on. There will be more questions at the end. And if you leave your hand up, you'll be the very first person I call on. But we're gonna take a 5-minute break and I'm gonna start talking again at 3:07.
You guys getting any of this? I like to hear the questions, but it's like, are you listening?
Yeah, I know.
Because she just went over that.
She's getting a little testy up there, too. She's tired of it, too.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. One for your purse. It's always, I always like to have one in my glove box because, I mean, how many times have you been out running around showing houses or you just get busy and you don't have time to stop for lunch? And it's like, it gets you by.
Good.
I don't know if you guys can hear me, but I have a question. Susan, can you hear me? It's Rosie.
I can hear you.
Oh, good. Is my audio? Okay, good. I did have a question though. I don't know if anyone's monitoring the chat group, but we can't answer questions to Annie Fitzsimmons because we're on this Zoom, so she can't even see us or hear us.
Okay.
What's that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what's your question?
My question is, she's saying that, you know, she keeps flipping back and forth of NAR and NWMLS because it's a different story because we're not a part of the settlement. Will the MLS not have the commission disclosed on there? I heard two different things.
The commission, the RMLS is not a NAR MLS. It's a broker-owned independent MLS. And they made their own decision on that. They're not following what NAR stipulated to. And we are allowed to put offers of commission on our listings in our Northwest MLS. So that will continue for us. So that's good news.
That is great news. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Susan, I have a question. This may or may not pertain to this, but I have a listing. I'm going to be a dual agent. It's a house I sold in the past. They just called me up they resell, and so I've got a buyer for them. And they don't want to pay part of their commission. And so I'm asking for truckles and for both sides. And so the buyer doesn't have the money, not to come out at closing. So I discussed with her maybe changing the purchase price. And she was agreeable to that. She liked that idea, the buyer. Is that okay?
This really adds up when you add on the other fees, so the
And then,
total.
so if the price is lower, then should be able to raise. Or if the price is higher, the seller would be able to.
Right. Okay. Okay.
But remember that whatever is on the 141 has to match what's on the top. If it doesn't match and things change, we're gonna think that you should amend your BBSA to match.
So I have a question because my BBSA says 3 truckles on the buyer side. And so I could take 2 and not have to.
Amanda and Tamara, I'm gonna ask you guys to hang on until we get to the end of the materials. Are you okay with that? All right, thank you.
Yes.
But
Gotta
if you
give up
keep-
the mood, yes.
There you go. If you keep your hands up, then, like I said, you'll be first in line.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I didn't, I'm like, don't talk about that. You just give me my stuff.
Okay, it's 3:07. Let's finish up. So now we are going to transition in the class into talking about use of the purchase and sale agreement consistent with everything else that we've been talking about. When you write a purchase and sale agreement as a buyer broker, you must disclose to the buyer, this is a matter of Washington law. You must disclose to the buyer any terms of compensation offered by the seller or the listing firm. This is necessarily going to be part of your purchase and sale agreement. It is not part of the buyer brokerage services agreement because it is dependent upon the actual property that buyer wants to purchase and whether or not seller is offering compensation. You must disclose to a buyer any offer of compensation by a seller or a listing firm. The place to do that in the revised purchase and sale agreement. So what we're about to talk about is the purchase and sale agreement that will be released for your use, excuse me, on August 15th. Statewide Form 21, released on August 15th for use by all brokers across the state, has a very, very different paragraph 17. It's still labeled buyer broker compensation, but the use and the effect of paragraph 17 is radically different than the way you have used paragraph 17 previously. If you want to be paid compensation, pay attention to what we're about to discuss with respect to Form 21, paragraph 17. There are now 2 blanks in Form 21, paragraph 17. In the first blank, you will identify, you will disclose whatever compensation seller has offered to a buyer broker. So in the first blank, you disclose the amount of compensation that seller has offered to a buyer broker. In the second blank, you identify the amount of compensation that buyer is asking seller to pay to the buyer broker. So the first blank is what seller has offered. The second blank is what the seller is actually going to pay the buyer broker at closing. If you've taken a class with me in the past, on this topic, You have probably heard me say something that is no longer true. I used to say, don't ever negotiate the actual amount of compensation on the face of the purchase and sale agreement. That is now the exact opposite. Now, with the revised Form 21, you must negotiate compensation on the face of the purchase and sale agreement. And if you fail to do so, you will not be paid compensation by the seller as the buyer broker. You will not be paid compensation by the seller. So let's look at how the provision works. This is what you're going to see, the highlighted, I highlighted it so that just to draw your attention to it. It's obviously not really highlighted on the form. So this is a picture of what the Form 21 revised paragraph 17 looks like on the face of the Form 21. It is supported by the boilerplate language in the back of the form under paragraph U. You should read all of this language at some point and become familiar with it, but I want to draw your attention to this boilerplate language starting in the third sentence. The third sentence of paragraph U says, the compensation offered by seller to the buyer brokerage firm, if any, is set forth in specific term number 17A. You see the little A underneath that first blank. That's what it's talking about. And if there is any inconsistency between the buyer brokerage firm's compensation offered and the description of the offered compensation stated in specific term number 17A, the term shall be as set forth in the published offer. What on earth does that mean? I will say that for the vast majority of your transactions, it means nothing, and you won't care about that language. What it actually says is, let's say that in the Northwest MLS listing and printout, seller has offered 5 chocolate truffles. And when you as the buyer broker fill out the purchase and sale agreement, you put into paragraph A that seller has offered 10 chocolate truffles. And then you put in paragraph B that seller will pay 10 chocolate truffles. And seller signs the purchase and sale agreement. What that means is that seller is going to pay 10 chocolate truffles to the buyer broker at closing. And it also means that there's an error in paragraph A, but that error probably has no real world consequence to anybody. Because the buyer and the seller have agreed in paragraph B that the seller is actually going to pay whatever that amount is. But there is an occasion when it will matter. We're going to talk, I think, let me keep going. I think I have a slide that talks about how it's going to matter. Oh, here it is. Why is this language important? First of all, you have a state law obligation to disclose to the buyer the actual amount of compensation the seller has offered. If you get it wrong, then you have failed to act consistently with your state law requirement. State law requires that if the seller is offering 5 chocolate truffles, you disclose to the buyer that the seller is offering 5 chocolate truffles. If you say the seller is offering 10 chocolate truffles when they're only offering 5 chocolate truffles, then you have not adhered to your state law requirement. If you're a Northwest MLS member, the amount of compensation the seller is offered is probably going to auto-populate to that number, auto-populate to that blank. So if the seller is offered 5 chocolate truffles, it's going to auto-populate to 17A. If you are an NAR MLS member, you're going to have to do your research to find out what seller's offer of compensation is, and you're going to write it in that blank. This is where it makes a lot of sense, NAR MLS listing brokers, for you to have something that you can send to the buyer broker to substantiate the compensation seller has offered. So either that addendum to the listing agreement or the standalone form, so that when the buyer broker says, hey, listing broker, I need to disclose to my buyer whatever the seller has offered, if any, can you send me something to verify that? So that the buyer broker can then keep that in their firm's transaction folder for proof later, or maybe in the purpose of an audit. If you don't get something like that from the listing broker, then my recommendation in AR MLS buyer brokers is that you take a screenshot of whatever it is you are relying on. If it's a picture of the listing broker's website or a social media advertising, document what it is that you're relying upon. And again, it becomes, let me see what my next slide is. It becomes important, again, I'm going to tell you in a minute why it's really big deal that you be able to document the compensation that the seller has actually offered. Before we get there though, let's look at the rest of the usage of paragraph 17 in Form 21. So we get to that second blank. Now we're looking at the fourth sentence in the boilerplate paragraph U, and the fourth sentence says, seller shall pay the buyer brokerage firm compensation set forth in specific term number 17B. So now we've got the boilerplate language saying that the first provision is what seller is offered, but the second provision is what seller is going to pay. So understand that when we reach mutual acceptance, whatever amount is in 17B, that is the amount that seller is paying regardless of anything else that's happened in the transaction. Seller offered something, didn't offer anything, none of that really matters. Once seller agrees in paragraph 17B to pay whatever the amount is, that's what seller is obligated to pay at closing. Buyer brokers, if you skip over paragraph 17 on the face of Form 21 and you don't fill anything into that provision, and I can't tell you how many hotline questions I've gotten from brokers who want to know in the past when I've skipped over paragraph 17, or I'm the listing broker and the buyer skipped over paragraph 17. Does it really matter? The answer after August 15th is if you skip paragraph 17 by a broker, you're not getting any compensation from the seller. It's that simple. If you don't have something written in to paragraph 17B by your brokers, you are not getting paid by seller. Period. End of story. So now we get to this checkbox provision at the end of the paragraph 17. We've talked about the first blank, we've talked about the second blank, and now we have a checkbox for something called addendum for buyer credit. This provision necessarily assumes that seller has offered more than buyer broker is getting paid. Seller has offered 10 chocolate truffles, buyer broker is only going to get paid 5 chocolate truffles. So paragraph A says 10, paragraph B says 5. That means that when you do the math problem, there's 5 chocolate truffles left over. Or let's use different numbers just to make it clearer. Seller's offered 10, buyer broker is going to get paid 7. We have 3 chocolate truffles left over. What is going to happen to those 3 chocolate truffles, the overage between what seller is offered and buyer broker is getting paid? That only in that scenario where the number in B is smaller than the number in A, only in that scenario would you ever check the box for addendum for buyer credit. Because addendum for buyer credit necessarily means that there is overage between what the seller has offered and the buyer broker is getting paid. If we're even Steven, if we've got 5 chocolate truffles that are offered and 5 chocolate truffles that are getting paid, you would never mark the addendum for buyer credit. It just wouldn't make any sense. So now let's say we're living in this world where seller offered 10 chocolate truffles, buyer broker is going to get paid 7 chocolate truffles. We've got 3 extra chocolate truffles. How are you going to account for what will happen to those 3 chocolate truffles? You're going to do it in one of 2 ways. You are either going to mark the box addendum for buyer credit, which means that you will attach a Form 41C, or you're going to account for the overage in some other way. For example, you could use the Form 22A loan cost provision, paragraph 3 of Form 22A. let's look at the Form 41C because the August 15th version of Form 41C looks nothing like the old Form 41C. Remember the old Form 41C used to have those 4 checkbox provisions and it was pretty complicated. And where you would negotiate for seller's payment of buyer broker compensation was on Form 41C, no longer true after August 15th. After August 15th, you negotiate for seller's payment of buyer broker compensation on the face of Form 21 in paragraph 17. And the only time you're going to use 41C is if seller has offered more compensation than what buyer broker is going to get paid. And you could, in that scenario, mark the box, addendum for buyer credit, and attach the Form 41C. And you will see that there are now no moving parts to Form 41C. There is one place for you to mark a checkbox if you choose, and that's in that second boilerplate provision. And all that says is if the overage is greater than the lender will allow as a credit to the buyer, then the additional overage amount will either reduce the purchase price or be returned to the seller. And if you don't mark the box for reduce the purchase price, then it defaults to return to the seller. So let's say you've got seller offering 10 chocolate truffles, buyer broker is going to get paid 7 chocolate truffles. The most credit that the lender will allow to buyer's benefit at closing is 2 chocolate truffles. We've got this extra 1 chocolate truffle. The checkbox provision determines whether or not the purchase price is reduced by a single chocolate truffle or whether or not that goes to seller at closing. Just doesn't get used basically. That's your first option of what do you do with the overage between what seller has offered and buyer broker is going to get paid. I would suggest that the second option is that you might use Form 22A paragraph 3, the loan cost provision. And in the loan cost provision of Form 22A, buyer asks seller to pay, using our same numbers, 3 chocolate truffles towards payment of buyer's closing costs. And you will see in the boilerplate language that buyer's closing cost is a defined term, and it essentially means any amount that the buyer's lender will allow. So it could be traditional closing costs. It could be something more than traditional closing costs, depending on what the lender will allow. But you would never use both Form 41C and Form 22A to address the same amount of money. So in our scenario, sellers offered 10 chocolate truffles, buyer broker's going to get paid 7. We've got 3 extra chocolate truffles. You would never use both Form 41C and Form 22A to address that 3% of chocolate truffle. I'm sorry, those 3 chocolate truffles. Because if you use both Form 41C and Form 22A, seller is not paying 3 chocolate truffles. Seller is paying 6 chocolate truffles. Because seller would have an obligation under Form 41C and under Form 22A to contribute that amount to buyer's benefit at closing. If you read the plain language of Form 41C, you will see that the amount that we're dealing with is never addressed specifically. Instead, what it says is the difference between the amount a seller's offer for buyer brokerage firm compensation and the amount to be paid. So Form 41C never says to the seller, you're going to pay 3 chocolate truffles at closing. It says whatever the math problem says is the difference between 17A and 17B, you're going to contribute that amount to the buyer at closing. As opposed to using Form 22A paragraph 3, you're going to write the exact amount in so everybody has it in front of them, the number or the amount, the percentage that we're dealing with. You're not going to use both because if you do, you're going to double seller's obligation. So then the question is, well, then which one do I want to use? Do I want to use 41C or do I want to use 22A paragraph 3? 41C speaks very broadly to buyer's credit. There's no restriction on what it might be credited towards. And if you check the box for reduction of purchase price, if you find yourself in a scenario where the credit is greater than the buyer's lender will allow the buyer to absorb as a credit from seller, then you're going to reduce the purchase price anyway. So 41C works broadly in buyer's favor. Form 22A specifies the closing costs that can be paid by seller's contribution. And if the amount of the overage exceeds, if 3 chocolate truffles is more than buyer's closing costs allowed by lender, then seller's going to get that back. So that would bode in favor of using the Form 41C, but it's not quite that simple. In Form 22A, you can always ask the seller to allow ask the lender to allow seller to contribute towards things like points and prepaids and pay down of buyer debt. But the answer is more complicated than that. I would submit that as an NAR MLS member, the safer bet between Form 41C and Form 22A is Form 22A. Form 41C, again, broader application. Form 22A, more narrow. You can expand the application of Form 22A if buyer's lender will allow seller's contribution of costs to pay things like points and prepaids and maybe even reduce some of buyer's existing debt. But here's the risk. The risk resides in that boilerplate language, that third sentence of paragraph U. Because that third sentence of paragraph U describes the amount in the first blank, 17A, as the amount of seller's offer of compensation. And it goes on to say that if the amount written into 17A is different than the published amount of compensation, then the published amount of compensation is the actual amount of compensation that seller offered. Okay, let me give some real world examples because it sounds really confusing. I know it is confusing as I'm just using words. So let me give you some examples. If you're a Northwest MLS member, this is not probably a big deal, because the published offer of compensation is whatever is published in the MLS. Easy. Seller's offering 10 chocolate truffles, then seller's offering 10 chocolate truffles. That number is going to auto-populate, and you can pull up a picture of the MLS printout and prove what seller offered. But let's say you're an NAR MLS member for a minute. And you look at seller's website, and it says that seller is offering 10 chocolate truffles. That was 2 weeks ago when the property first went on the market, and you thought, ooh, this is kind of a cool property. I would love for a buyer to be interested in it. Oh, yay, now 2 weeks later, I have a buyer who's interested in purchasing this property. And I remember that seller was offering 10 chocolate truffles because I thought that was a handsome offer of compensation. But in the intervening time, the seller has grown frustrated with not getting any offers. And so seller has said to the listing broker, reduce the price, take it from $500,000 to $490,000, and I'm no longer willing to pay 10 chocolate truffles. I'm only going to pay 5 chocolate truffles. And so now listing broker, they change their website. Maybe they even put a social media post out there and they reduce the amount of compensation, but you didn't see it. And so buyer broker, you listed in provision 17A, that first blank, that seller is offering 10 chocolate truffles. And you didn't know that seller had changed their published offer of compensation to 5 chocolate truffles. You're going to get paid 5 chocolate truffles. And so you write 10 in that first blank, and then you write 5 in the second blank, and you and the buyer both believe that now there's 5 extra chocolate truffles. You attach a Form 41C, which only has meaning if there is a difference between the amount in the first blank and the amount in the second blank. You think there's a difference in the amount, but in fact, you're wrong. because the boilerplate language of paragraph U says that if you put the wrong number in the first place, then whatever the actual published rate is really applies. And so if seller can prove that the published rate of compensation was now 5 chocolate truffles rather than the 10 that you thought it was, and all you've done is mark credit buyer addendum for buyer credit and attached to 41C, which never defines on its face the actual amount of credit, then the math problem would say buyer really doesn't get any credit, even though you led buyer to believe that they do. Which means that the safer bet in that scenario is to use the Form 22A paragraph 3 provision, particularly as an NAR MLS member, and specify in Form 22A paragraph 3 that seller will contribute 5 chocolate truffles towards the payment of buyer's closing costs. More often than not, the overage is not going to be more than what a lender would allow a seller to contribute towards a buyer's closing costs. And again, if it is, then you can probably get the lender to allow the seller to contribute other things than more than just the traditional closing costs. But that's a smaller problem, in my opinion, than the problem of defining what is the published offer of compensation, which is the term used in the boilerplate language of paragraph U when you are an NAR MLS member. I know that was really complicated and really confusing, and I'm happy to take questions on it when we get to the end, but let's go ahead and get through the balance of the materials. If you use the 22A instead of the 41C, instead of marking that box for addendum for buyer credit, and you want to apply seller's overage by use of Form 22A, then buyer brokers be prepared to explain that to the seller. Do not assume that either seller or listing broker are going to correlate that the overage from seller's offer to the amount you're taking is what you are asking to seller to contribute towards a buyer closing costs. Be prepared to explain that yourself. Okay, let's practice some of this. Let's put it all together in the forms that you actually use. Here's some scenarios. Buyer says, I agree that you're worth 10 chocolate truffles, broker, but if seller won't pay you, I have only 1 chocolate truffle to use for payment of your compensation. It will be impossible for me to pay more than 1 chocolate truffle if seller won't pay. Question then is, how do you complete Form 41, paragraph 5? We're looking only at the first provision right now. If you and the buyer both agree that your services are worth 10 chocolate truffles, the buyer says, but I only have 1 chocolate truffle to pay you if seller won't pay. The question came to me the first time, well, then am I morally, ethically restrained to putting only 1 chocolate truffle in that blank? No. If the compensation you want to receive is 10 chocolate truffles, then you're going to write 10 chocolate truffles in that blank. And if you get to a place where the seller is not offering any chocolate truffles, then your conversation with the buyer sounds like this. Buyer, I know you want to purchase that property, but you can't afford it. The closing costs that you will have to pay are greater than you can pay, and seller is not willing to help you with your closing costs. Or maybe it sounds like this. Buyer, you owe me 10 chocolate truffles. You told me from the very beginning if we were in the situation you could only pay 1 chocolate truffle. You still owe me 10 chocolate truffles, but I would be willing to reduce my compensation to whatever number you say. 5 chocolate truffles. Can you come up with another 4? I'll go all the way down to 1 chocolate truffle. I'm not telling you you're going to reduce your compensation, but your conversation with the buyer is going to be a problem-solving conversation. We can either get you to a number that you can live with, or buyer, we're going to go find another piece of property because you can't afford this one. The fact is, you have a financial hurdle to overcome in order to own this property. And whether that financial hurdle exists because the purchase price is higher than you can afford, or because the lender fees are higher than you can afford, or because the seller is not willing to pay any of your buyer brokerage compensation. The fact is, buyer, this property costs more than you can afford. So we were looking when we found this one. We're going to keep looking and find something better. That's the answer unless you're willing to reduce the compensation that you will take in this transaction. But there is nothing unethical or immoral about you putting in this exact scenario the compensation that you and the buyer agree you should be compensated. Buyer says to you, I agree that you're worth 10 chocolate truffles and then some. Whatever seller offers, you should get. How do you complete Form 41, paragraph 5? Can you just write as offered by seller? Can you write 10 plus chocolate truffles? The answer is nope. You write 10 chocolate truffles. And if your buyer brokerage services agreement needs to be amended before you write the offer for buyer, then so be it. But you cannot collect more than 10 chocolate truffles, regardless of what the seller's offering, if 10 chocolate truffles is the agreed amount when you write the purchase and sale agreement. You and buyer agree that 10 chocolate truffles is fair compensation, but buyer wants a break if you're a dual agent and agrees that you will do more work if seller is a FSBO. How do you complete Form 41, paragraph 5 to reflect these agreements? You would put into the first blank that buyer is going to pay you 10 chocolate truffles, assuming the seller is represented. You could agree to 5 chocolate truffles if you're a dual agent. And you could agree that that buyer will pay you 15 chocolate truffles if the seller is unrepresented. That's how you use all of those blanks together. You and the buyer agree that if buyer purchases a house, you should receive 5 chocolate truffles. But if buyer purchases raw land, you should receive 10 chocolate truffles. How do you complete Form 41 in a scenario like that? You could potentially write something just into the other provision to explain it. My suggestion, and this is a suggestion only, is that you in the other section might write see other section below, and then in the other section below, you are going to write the terms of agreement between you and your buyer. So this is an example. You're probably not going to use these exact words, but you would say something to the effect of the compensation shall be 5 chocolate truffles if buyer purchases improved property, and shall be 10 chocolate truffles if buyer purchases unimproved property. The word compensation in my example is capitalized because that is a defined term in Form 41. Form 41 defines the word compensation using a capital C as the compensation that we're describing here, the compensation that the buyer broker will be paid. You and the buyer agree that if buyer purchases a house up to a certain amount, your compensation should be 10 chocolate truffles. But if buyer purchases property in excess of that amount, your compensation should be 5 chocolate truffles. How do you complete Form 41? Again, the same suggestion, right? See other section below. And then you're going to draft whatever those terms of compensation, the variable rate compensation terms might be. Again, just example language up here. I'm not suggesting this is the language you're going to actually use, but you're going to have to craft your own language that would represent what the agreement is between you and your buyer. It is possible to use Form 41 in a variable compensation arrangement. Okay, let's move to your completion of Form 21. Buyer and broker enter a brokerage services agreement agreeing that broker will be paid X%. Buyer finds property where seller is offering 0. How will you complete the Form 21? First blank, you're going to write 0. And in that second blank, you're going to write X%. If seller agrees to buyer's offer, then seller will be paying buyer brokerage compensation at closing in the amount of X%. Buyer and broker enter a brokerage services agreement agreeing that broker will be paid 10 chocolate truffles. Buyer finds property where seller is offering only 5 chocolate truffles. How will you complete the Form 21? 5 truffles is what seller is offering. That goes in 17A. Assuming that the buyer wants you to collect all 10 chocolate truffles from the seller, then you will write 10 truffles in that second blank. And then buyer will, and then if seller agrees, seller will pay you 10 chocolate truffles at closing. Buyer and broker enter a BBSA agreeing that broker will be paid 5 chocolate truffles. Buyer finds property where seller is offering 10 chocolate truffles. How will you complete the Form 21? In the first blank, you identify that seller is offered 10 chocolate truffles, and in the second blank, you write 5 truffles because that's what the seller will pay you at closing. And then you have a choice. You will either mark the addendum for buyer credit box and add the Form 41C, or you will leave blank the box addendum for buyer credit, and you will simply add a Form 22A, marking paragraph 3 to show that seller will contribute 5 chocolate truffles towards buyer's payment of closing costs. Countering a buyer's offer. Buyer and broker enter a BBSA agreeing that broker will be paid 10 chocolate truffles. Buyer finds property where seller is offering only 5 chocolate truffles. Buyer completes Form 21, line 17, showing seller's offer of 5 chocolate truffles in the first blank and writing 10 in the second blank. You are the listing broker. Seller is only willing to pay 5 truffles. How do you write seller's counteroffer? Before we get there, let me make something really clear. All of this time I've been talking about how buyer brokers fill out paragraph 17. Listing brokers, you must train yourselves to pay attention to buyer's paragraph 17. If you treat, as a listing broker, if you treat paragraph 17 as a flyover provision, your seller is going to pay compensation to a buyer broker that you and the seller never even noticed. Listing brokers, you must pay attention to paragraph 17. And in this instance, you must point out to seller that seller's proceeds will be reduced by an additional 5 chocolate truffles if they don't counter buyer's offer. And when seller says, yeah, no, I'm not doing that, I'm not paying more than 5 chocolate truffles to buyer broker, then you must draft a counter offer for seller. How do you do that? There are going to be some designated brokers out there who say, Annie, shut up, do not say that. But I'm going to tell you, as the hotline lawyer, I don't care if the only provision that you're modifying through the form of your counteroffer, you're not changing any other terms. The only term seller is countering is the amount of compensation that will be paid to the buyer broker. Then in that instance, I am fine with you physically striking through the number 10 in that second blank on paragraph 17 on the face of this purchase and sale agreement, striking the 10, writing in 5, having seller initial that. Lots of designated brokers out there say, nope, we don't counter offers that way. You only counter offers using Form 36. And if that is your designated broker's office policy, then you adhere to your firm's office policy every single time. But if your firm doesn't have that office policy, I think it makes an easy form to read if that's the only counter offer term. But if the seller is countering more than one term, then you go to your Form 36. And on your Form 36, in addition to all the other counteroffer terms, you write language, something along the lines of buyer brokerage compensation, again, a defined term, so it's all in caps. Buyer brokerage compensation, amount to be paid by seller shall be 5 truffles. Buyer says, wait a minute, I'm going to pay the buyer broker compensation, or at least some portion of it. You and buyer enter a BBSA agreeing that you will be paid 10 chocolate truffles. Buyer finds property where seller is offering only 5 chocolate truffles, and buyer does not want to ask seller to pay more. Buyer says, I will pay the difference. So when you're writing buyer's offer, you fill out paragraph 17, the first blank, to say that seller has offered 5 truffles, and you fill out the second blank to say seller will pay 5 truffles. buyer and seller reach mutual acceptance. When you open an escrow, you deliver along with the purchase and sale agreement, you deliver to escrow Form 40A, putting escrow on notice that buyer will pay 5 chocolate truffles towards buyer broker's compensation. So in this case, escrow, you're going to, on the settlement statement, you're going to show in seller's column 5 chocolate truffles to buyer broker, and you're also going to show in buyer's column 5 chocolate truffles to buyer broker. You're going to put escrow on notice of that through delivery of some escrow instruction. You could use Form 40A as a statewide form. Okay, Amanda.
Hi.
Hi.
If I am not representing buyer or seller and my friend Jamie is representing buyer and she goes out of town and wants me to do a showing for her, do I need a separate BBSA for that client? For that one?
Is your friend in the license to the same firm as you?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need a separate agreement. You just need to use a form. She needs to use a Form 41A to amend the existing buyer brokerage services agreement to name you as an additional agent of the buyer. And that could be limited to the time while the original buyer broker is out of town, but you must do that. You can't just help her out. You gotta have that buyer brokerage services agreement.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, John.
On Form 21, line 17, if you don't know what the seller is offering for compensation, is it okay just to write unknown?
I'm worried about that. I can imagine a very small set of circumstances where truly you have done your very, very best to get the information and you can't. And you have no choice but to write unknown because that is the honest answer from your perspective. I'm really hesitant to say that out loud in a class because I don't want to create any kind of a cop-out approach for any broker to say, you know what, it's late and I'm tired and I don't know what it is, so I'm not going to do the work of trying to find out what it is. You have an obligation under Washington law to disclose what seller has offered. If you use your best due diligence to find it out and you can't, then I think you should document your firm's transaction folder with the efforts you undertook. And if you have no other choice but to write unknown, then that's what you would write.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Josh.
My question is going a little different direction on a scenario that you did earlier. So seller has their home on the market, $1 million, right? And they get a lowball offer for 800, and they were offering 10 truffles when they were asking $1 million for the home, and now they have a low offer. Can they counter what can they change what they were offering for truffles?
So are you a Northwest MLS member or an NAR MLS member?
I don't know. That was my other part. Is this a Northwest MLS question or is this a state law
Which
question?
are you? Which are you?
Northwest MLS.
Okay, so the answer is different for the for whether you're a Northwest MLS or an NAR MLS. 1A, Form 1A, which is the form you would be using as your listing agreement, I presume, has boilerplate language in it which says that a seller may not reduce or may not withdraw or modify their offer of compensation to a buyer broker for 3 days following a buyer's notification of intent to write an offer. So in that scenario, the seller could not say, I'm not going to pay the 10 chocolate truffles, but they can always increase the price. They can essentially get to the same place. If they agree to the $800,000 price, then they're obligated to those 10 chocolate truffles based on Northwest MLS rules, but they don't have to agree to the $800,000 price unless, they can modify their proceeds in that format. For an NAR MLS answer, it depends entirely on whatever the listing firm's language is in that additional documentation that the listing firm comes up with for the seller to make an offer of compensation. And buyer brokers, I would assume, if I were you, I would always just presume that seller has the right to withdraw that offer of compensation at any time. And in this light, it really doesn't matter, because if seller has offered 10 chocolate truffles on their $1 million listing, and now buyer offers 800,000 through an NAR MLS, seller says, look, I'll take the 800,000, but I'm not paying 10 chocolate truffles, then seller's counter offer would be not to the purchase price, but to the buyer broker compensation. So seller would counter the buyer broker compensation at that point, not offer 10 chocolate, maybe offer 0 chocolate truffles and leave the purchase price alone. An NAR MLS seller might be able to do that. A Northwest MLS seller couldn't.
Unless the 3 days have passed?
Unless the contractual language of the listing agreement doesn't present a barrier. That's right.
Thank you.
Gina.
Okay, so just a point of clarification on the on an NAR office, you cannot say in remarks that seller is offering compensation or is contemplating on.
Nope.
Okay.
You can't put it in the
Okay.
not anywhere.
So second thing, okay, so read my notes. So you're not supposed to, let's see, why, so there's language in paragraph U, at which I am not looking, that says something about the published compensation amount. Well, I'm kind of thinking I don't want to publish the compensation amount anywhere. I just want people to call me if they want to know.
You're not allowed to do that. The NAR settlement agreements requires that if a seller is offered compensation, you have to publish it somewhere. And I would argue that Washington law does as well, because you are required to take no action that's adverse or detrimental to the seller's interest in the transaction. You are required to engage with reasonable skill and care. And when a seller has asked you to promote their property by offering compensation to a buyer broker, it is not up to you as a listing broker to say, I'm not going to do that.
We can't put it in the MLS, but so would a little sign on this physical sign of the property fulfill that requirement then? To say compensation is being offered to buyer's agents or something to that
Well,
effect?
if your seller has offered a specific dollar amount of compensation, you're going to have to disclose that somewhere. You're going to want to publish that offer of compensation somewhere, whether it's your website, social media, the flyer on the kitchen countertop. You need to publish that offer of compensation somewhere.
Okay, so if I put it on the flyer in the house, that would be that.
I would think that'd be great.
Okay, thank you so much.
Carrie.
Yeah, so it's about the variable compensation on the buyer brokerage services agreement. I was under the impression that we could not do variable compensation.
You can't create a range. You can't say seller's going to pay buyer's going to pay between X and Y% and then take the higher number, because you have to give the buyer a specific amount. But a variable rate compensation says, in this scenario, I'm going to get paid this amount. In this scenario, I'm going to get paid this amount. So it is a specific amount, but the amount that it's going to be depends upon what the property is that the buyer finds.
What the type of property.
About that.
So it's not actually variable. It's just basically you've got two different agreements, one for properties that fall under this and one for properties that fall under this.
I'm happy for you to explain it that way. Yep, I don't disagree with this.
Cool.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. You're welcome. Aisha, go ahead.
Me again. I just had a recent thing happened, and it's a little confusing and it falls under what we're talking about, but I have the buyer, they're interested in a property. They wanted to take their offer, but they didn't want to pay me, and buyer could not afford me. What happens in that case if the guy is like, yep, I'm going to accept your offer, I am just not going to pay the agent?
Yeah, buyer, it's the same thing that happens anytime somebody has a contractual obligation that they refuse to perform. They're in breach of contract. If you have, you would talk to your lawyer. If your lawyer agrees that they're in breach of contract and you've been damaged, then you could sue for, I'm sorry, you don't have to talk to a lawyer, but that would be my recommendation, and you can sue them for damages. Your recourse would be a lawsuit if they refuse to honor the requirement of their contract.
So, okay, because of the fact that we have a signed contract, they're obligated to pay me even though we discussed, okay, I see what you're saying. So then if I'm like, hey, don't worry about paying me, how do I get out of that? Is it just the amendment?
Well, you better go talk to your designated broker before you say, just don't pay me, because remember, the buyer agency agreement is not a contract between the buyer and you. You're not a party to that contract at all.
Okay.
It's a contract between the buyer and your firm. You don't have the authority to say, just don't pay that.
Okay, see,
It's up to your designated brokers. Go talk to your designated broker in that circumstance. Your designated broker may be able to help you find a different solution as well.
okay, perfect, thank you.
Melissa?
Thank you. When there was additional compensation, I think you said you use it to put it on the 22A for the buyer versus the 41C.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at your name there, Melissa, with Remax North. I'm assuming that you are a Northwest MLS member?
No, I'm a Remax Northwest, but I am in the Tri-Cities, so I am a package.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry about that. You see, that's what you get making assumptions. My recommendation would be that unless the circumstances are extraordinary, I would use the Form 22A to cover any overage in the seller's offer of compensation rather than the Form 41C if you are an NAR MLS member.
So what if we were already using a Form 22A to just define our financing? Do we just amend it or add it to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you've already negotiated, I mean, if you consider that a typical buyer's closing costs are about 3% of the purchase price, and seller is already poised to agree to pay 3% of the purchase price towards buyer's closing costs, and now you got another 5 chocolate truffles to deal with, then the lender may not allow the seller to credit that much to the buyer as lender closing costs, and in that case, then that might be an example of a time when you would use the Form 41C. And here's what I would do in that circumstance. If you're an NAR MLS member and you're planning to use the addendum for credit to buyer or the Form 41C, I would communicate with the listing broker prior to writing the purchase and sale agreement, certainly prior to mutual acceptance. And I would ask the listing broker to clarify in writing the published amount of compensation that seller has offered. And I would make it really clear that what I'm needing to know is the amount of the published offer of compensation from the seller.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then of course you keep all of that in your firm's transaction folder. Haniel.
Thank you. 2 questions. First, I'm in Northwest MLS just in case it does matter. The firm been instructed on using a 40 or 48. I pulled it up and it asked for an authorized signature. Who is the authorized signature? Does that make?
I lost you. I lost part of your question. I got that you're a Northwest MLS member, and I didn't hear much after that.
Yeah. So using a 40 or the 48, it requires it. It says that it's asking for an authorized signature, an authorized signer on it. Who is that authorized signer? Is that the designated broker, or is it myself, or?
That's up to you and your designated broker, but there are many times that an agent signs that as the authorized signature.
My second question comes down to, in the past, we had clients that represented the buyer's agent that a portion of the truffles that we have go to them towards closing costs, so on and so forth. So in the past, what we had done was we negotiate, let's say on that 17 A and B, you would put, the seller's offering truffles, and we're saying there's going to be 10 truffles, but then we want to take a portion of that amount of truffles from us and credit it towards the buyer. But you can't really do that with the boilerplate knowledge now inside the 41C. Could you use the other inside of that? And even though it's a flip-flop on the math, then put that into another, where we say that additional profit.
So let me make sure I understand what you're saying. The buyer broker is going to get a credit for the 10 chocolate truffles, but then you at closing are going to give the buyer the benefit of some of those chocolate truffles. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, ma'am.
That happens in escrow. All that matters on the face of the purchase and sale agreement is that the seller is paying the buyer brokerage firm 10 chocolate truffles. If the buyer brokerage firm then has a different agreement with the buyer that I'm going to credit some of my compensation to you at closing, that's up to the buyer brokerage firm, the buyer, lender, and escrow. That has nothing to do with the purchase and sale agreement with seller.
Thank you.
Yep, Andy.
Hello. If the seller chooses buyer to request compensation, what do we put on the PSA line 17A?
There would be 0 offer of compensation. If the seller has said, ask for it, but I'm not offering any, then it would be 0. Okay, I am planning on sticking around and answering questions for as long as there are people asking questions, but we are more or less at the end of the class, the 4 o'clock mark. So Stacy, for those people who want to or need to hang up, would you give them their final marching orders, and then whoever wants to stick around for questions, you're welcome to do so.
Sure. Thank you for attending our class today. Early next week, you will receive a link with a survey for the class. You must complete that in order to receive your clock hours. We have noted those who have had a camera on and have had no camera on today, and that is how we will issue clock hours. Thank you again for being here, and you're free to log off for the afternoon.
Thank you. Okay, Kate.
Yeah, so I am looking at Form 41C. So let's say that we do have an overage in the offer of compensation. Buyer wants it to be credited to them, but then checks the box that they would like it to be applied to the purchase price if there's an overage beyond what their lender allows. Wouldn't that, if we're dealing in percentages, create an uncertainty in what that credit amount would be, because the purchase price would be changing and therefore changing the percentages?
Probably. It's why it's better to just use chocolate truffles as your compensation.
I like it. Okay.
Probably, Kate, but that is way more sophisticated math than I'm willing to even contemplate at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. But I do understand what you're saying, and I don't have a solution to that conundrum.
Okay, I would like that lodged as something that would be lovely to address in the future if that ever gets changed.
So I'm not going to remember after this class. I need you to either file, are you a Northwest MLS member?
Yeah, I am.
File a speak up with the Northwest MLS. We use those speak ups to form the agenda for statewide forums task force meetings. And so
Okay.
that would be the best way to actually lodge that as a suggestion for a future revision.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Starlene.
Hi, so going back to BBSA, if I'm showing a buyer a property that I'm not listed, I'm not the listing agent, but I'm.
Hi guys, if you can hear me, this is Gabby. I'm gonna close the Zoom now. If you guys.
Than me, so she works for Brookshire Hathaway or something.
So you're gonna have to have your own BBSA with that buyer.
Okay, but I don't have to collect any money from them if I just want my friends to get that information, right?
So I was.
What?
Where's the what?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I had to step away.
I'm closing the Zoom, you guys. This is Gabby. I just put the slides in Facebook. I just posted it. So if you need them there, we are also, again, it's streaming on the 14th if you guys want to recap. But let us know. Thank you guys so much for coming. I appreciate it. And thanks for dealing with the wonky setup. Bye.